They buried the evidence, rewrote the records, and hoped we'd stop asking questions. But we never did. From ancient chambers sealed for millennia to modern conspiracies hiding in plain sight. History is not what we were taught. It is deeper, darker, and far more extraordinary. Every era left behind puzzles that brilliant minds have failed to solve. Every century holds a secret that someone, somewhere, desperately wanted forgotten. Tonight, we resurrect those secrets, one by one. So get comfortable, because the next 3 hours are going to change how you see everything. Imagine standing on the coast of the eastern Mediterranean in 1200 BC. The air smells of cedar and salt. Ships move across trade routes that have connected civilizations for centuries. Great cities hum with activity. Scribes recording harvests, merchants weighing silver, kings receiving letters from distant empires. It is, by every measure, the ancient world at its peak. Then, within the space of roughly 50 years, almost all of it disappears. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the most baffling events in human history. Not a slow decline, not a gradual fading, but a near-simultaneous unraveling of multiple powerful interconnected civilizations across a vast region, so sudden and so total that historians still struggle to explain it. The Mycenaean Greeks vanished. Their palace culture, with its elaborate bureaucracies, its linear B writing system, its intricate trade networks, simply ceased. Ugarit, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world, located on the coast of modern-day Syria, was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire, a superpower that had once negotiated treaties with Egypt as an equal, collapsed so completely that its very existence was forgotten for over 3,000 years, only rediscovered in the 19th century. Egypt survived, but barely. The great pharaohs of the new kingdom would never again project the same power. What happened? The clay tablets left behind offer fragments, but no full picture. One letter, recovered from the ruins of Ugarit and never sent, describes enemy ships spotted offshore. It reads with a quiet urgency that still resonates across 3 millennia. The city was asking for help. The help never came. Mainstream archaeology points to a convergence of factors. A prolonged drought, supported by paleoclimatic data from ancient pollen and sediment cores, may have devastated harvests across the region. Famine weakens empires. Hungry populations migrate. Internal revolts destabilize governments already stretched thin. There is also the matter of the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of raiders and migrants mentioned in Egyptian records. Rameses III claims to have defeated them in a great naval battle, and his temple walls at Medinet Habu depict the struggle in striking detail. But who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? Even today, their true identity remains contested. Some scholars see displaced populations from the Aegean. Others point to migrations from further west, possibly from around modern-day southern Europe. A minority of researchers suggest something far more disruptive, that the Sea Peoples were not invaders at all, but refugees, the scattered survivors of civilizations already collapsing elsewhere, moving desperately across a dying world. And then there is a more uncomfortable possibility. What if the collapse was systemic, the ancient world's first great globalization crisis? These civilizations were deeply dependent on one another for tin, copper, grain, and luxury goods. Bronze itself required the combination of copper and tin, materials rarely found in the same place. Remove one link in that chain, and the entire network fractures. Drought triggers famine. Famine triggers migration. Migration triggers conflict. Conflict disrupts trade. And a world built on interconnection begins to eat itself. Archaeology supports pieces of each theory. None of it explains everything. What is certain is this: within a few generations, the palace cultures of the eastern Mediterranean were gone. Writing systems were forgotten. Trade routes went silent. Population levels plummeted. Historians call the period that followed the Greek Dark Ages, and for good reason. An entire way of life vanished so completely that the people who came after had no memory it had ever existed. So what, exactly, broke the ancient world? And is it possible that the answer is still buried somewhere, in soil, in stone, or in a letter that was never delivered? Before moving to the next mystery. If you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. But the Bronze Age was not the last time history swallowed something whole. Sometimes it is not a civilization that disappears. Sometimes it is an army. Picture the Sahara Desert in 524 BC, not the Sahara of highways and satellite maps, but the Sahara as it existed in the ancient world, an almost incomprehensible expanse of sand, wind, and silence. A place where the horizon dissolves into itself, where the sun does not warm but punishes, where a man without water survives not days, but hours. Now imagine 50,000 soldiers marching into it, and never coming out. This is the story of the lost army of Cambyses II, one of antiquity's most enduring and haunting mysteries. A story that begins with conquest, moves through the desert like a ghost, and ends in a silence that has never fully been broken. Cambyses II was the son of Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had yet seen. By the time Cambyses inherited the throne, Persia already stretched from modern-day Iran to the edges of Central Asia. But Cambyses was not a man satisfied by inheritance. He wanted more. In 525 BC, he launched a campaign into Egypt, and with remarkable speed, he succeeded. Egypt fell. The ancient civilization that had endured for millennia became a Persian province. Flush with victory, Cambyses turned his attention further into Africa. Among his targets was the Oracle of Amun at Siwa, a sacred site deep in the western Egyptian desert, in an oasis that even today feels remote and otherworldly. The oracle had allegedly insulted Cambyses, or so the ancient sources suggest. Whether it was wounded pride, strategic ambition, or something else entirely, Cambyses dispatched an army toward Siwa. 50,000 men, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, soldiers of the most powerful empire on earth. They marched west from the Nile. They entered the desert. They were never seen again. Herodotus, writing roughly a century after the event, offers the only ancient account of what happened. He claims the army was destroyed by a catastrophic sandstorm somewhere in the desert, buried alive beneath the dunes. It is a dramatic image, and for centuries it was treated more as legend than history. 50,000 men, consumed by sand. It seemed almost too cinematic to be real. But then, in 2009, a pair of Italian archaeologists made an announcement that sent ripples through the historical community. Brothers Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione claimed to have discovered the remains of the army in the Egyptian desert. Bones, bronze weapons, and fragments of equipment scattered across a remote area near the Siwa oasis. The discovery appeared to support Herodotus almost exactly. A sandstorm, a mass burial, the desert as executioner. The Egyptian authorities were cautious. Independent verification proved difficult. The site was remote, access was limited, and the broader archaeological community remained divided. Some welcomed the find as a breakthrough. Others questioned the methodology and the conclusions. The debate has never been fully resolved. And so the questions remain. Was it truly a sandstorm? The Sahara is certainly capable of such violence. Storms capable of burying entire landscapes under meters of sand within hours. Ancient armies stretched across open terrain with no shelter would have been devastatingly vulnerable. There is nothing implausible about the mechanism. The desert has swallowed far more than soldiers. But other researchers are less certain. An army of 50,000 men would have required enormous logistical support. Food, water, animals, supply lines stretching back to the Nile. Moving such a force through one of the most hostile environments on Earth was not simply a military challenge. It was an organizational one of staggering complexity, Some historians suggest the army may have collapsed long before any storm, that men deserted, that supply lines failed, that soldiers died in small groups across hundreds of miles of desert, leaving no single catastrophic site to find. There is also the question of local knowledge. The oasis routes of the western desert were not unknown. Desert peoples had navigated them for generations. Did Cambyses have guides? Did those guides lead the army astray, whether by accident or design? Ancient sources hint at treachery, at deliberate misdirection. Some suggest that local priests or Egyptian loyalists may have sabotaged the expedition from within, feeding false information to Persian commanders who did not know the terrain and could not afford to doubt the men guiding them through it. And then there are the more speculative threads, the ones that exist at the edges of conventional scholarship. A small number of researchers have pointed to ancient Egyptian texts that speak of a great Persian force being destroyed not by nature, but by divine intervention, swallowed by the desert as punishment for Cambyses' desecration of Egyptian temples and sacred animals. These accounts are theological rather than historical, and mainstream scholars treat them accordingly. But they tell us something important. The disappearance of this army was so total, so complete, that even the people of the time struggled to explain it in purely human terms. Something happened out there, something that erased 50,000 men so thoroughly that 2,500 years later, we are still searching for them. The western Egyptian desert is vast beyond easy comprehension. Much of it remains archaeologically unexplored. Sand shifts constantly, revealing and reburying what lies beneath on timescales that have nothing to do with human urgency. It is entirely possible that the evidence exists: bones, weapons, armor, waiting beneath dunes that no researcher has yet reached. Or perhaps the army is scattered so widely, so thinly across such enormous distances, that we will never find enough in one place to say with certainty, here, this is where it ended. 50,000 soldiers, swallowed by sand, by chaos, by history itself. And somewhere in the desert, the silence continues. The desert takes things and leaves no explanation. But it is not the only place where people have simply ceased to exist. Sometimes it happens in a forest. Picture the outer banks of what is now North Carolina in the late 16th century. A narrow strip of land caught between the Atlantic Ocean and the still waters of Pamlico Sound. Dense woodland stretches inland, ancient and largely unmapped by European eyes. The air is thick with humidity in summer, biting cold in winter. It is a place of extraordinary natural beauty and extraordinary vulnerability. In 1587, 115 men, women, and children stepped ashore on Roanoke Island. They were English settlers, sent by Sir Walter Raleigh under the governorship of John White, with the ambition of establishing the first permanent English colony in the New World. They carried with them tools, seeds, livestock, and the quiet confidence of people who believed they were building something that would last. 3 years later, John White returned to find every single one of them gone. No bodies, no graves, no signs of battle or struggle, just an empty settlement, overgrown and silent, and a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. It is one of the most haunting images in American history. A ghost town before the country that would surround it even existed. And after more than 4 centuries of investigation, speculation, and excavation, no one can say with complete certainty what happened to those 115 people. The story begins to unravel almost immediately upon examination. John White had sailed back to England in 1587 to secure additional supplies for the struggling colony. What should have been a months-long absence stretched into 3 years, not by choice, but because England found itself consumed by a crisis of its own: the Spanish Armada. Every available ship was pressed into national defense. White was stranded, helpless, watching time pass while his family and his colonists waited on the other side of the world. When he finally returned in August 1590, the settlement was abandoned. The structures were partially dismantled, suggesting a planned departure rather than a panicked flight. Supplies and heavy equipment were missing, and there, carved cleanly into a post at the entrance of the fort, was the word Croatoan, the name of a nearby island and the people who inhabited it. White had arranged a signal before his departure. If the colonists were forced to leave, they would carve their destination into a tree. If they left under duress, they would add a cross. There was no cross, which suggested, at least to White, that the colonists had gone willingly to Croatoan Island, roughly 50 miles to the south. He never made it there. Storms forced his ships away from the coast, and he never returned to the Americas. The colonists were simply left, unrescued, uninvestigated, and eventually unfound. The mainstream historical view holds that the colonists most likely integrated with local Native American populations, either at Croatoan or further inland. This was not unusual by the standards of the time. Survival in an unfamiliar environment with dwindling resources often meant seeking the help of those who already knew the land. Several subsequent expeditions reported encountering Native American communities with gray eyes, European-style features, or knowledge of European customs. These accounts were never systematically documented, and their reliability is difficult to assess. But they are consistent with a theory of gradual assimilation rather than sudden catastrophe. Archaeological work has added careful weight to this possibility. Excavations on Hatteras Island, the site of the original Croatoan territory, have uncovered English artifacts in layers of soil predating later European contact. A signet ring, a token, objects with no obvious explanation other than early English presence. The evidence is fragmentary, but it points in a direction. And yet the mystery does not close so easily. Other theories have accumulated over the centuries, some grounded in evidence, others in circumstance and imagination. Some researchers have pointed to the possibility of violence, that the colonists were killed, either by hostile Native American groups with whom relations had already been tense before White's departure, or by Spanish forces operating along the American coast, who had every reason to eliminate a rival European settlement. Spanish records from the period mention awareness of the English colony. Whether they acted on that awareness remains unknown. There is also the theory of environmental catastrophe. Dendrochronological studies, the reading of tree rings to reconstruct historical climate, have revealed that the years of the Roanoke colony coincided with one of the most severe droughts the region had experienced in 8 centuries. A colony already struggling with food supplies, already dependent on uncertain relationships with local peoples, facing the collapse of its water and agricultural resources. That is a colony on the edge. What happens at the edge is rarely recorded. And then there are the stranger threads. A small number of researchers have pointed to Native American oral traditions that speak of pale-skinned people who came from the water and eventually became part of the community. These stories are treated carefully by most historians. Oral traditions are not literal history, and the line between genuine memory and later mythology is rarely clear. But they persist, they endure, and they suggest that something of those 115 people may have survived, transformed, absorbed into a world that left no written record. 400 years of searching have produced fragments, possibilities, and tantalizing near answers. But the full picture has never come into focus. 115 people walked into the American wilderness and did not come back. They left behind a single word, carved into wood, pointing toward something. An island, a people, a choice made in desperation or in hope. Was it a farewell? A direction? A final message from people who knew they might never be found? Or is it still, after all this time, simply a question waiting for its answer? Some questions are carved into wood. Others are carried into the wilderness by men who never return. The Roanoke colonists left a word behind. Percy Fawcett left almost nothing, just a trail of footprints that vanished into one of the most impenetrable places on Earth, and a mystery that has consumed explorers, historians, and dreamers for the better part of a century. Picture the Amazon basin in 1925. Not the Amazon of today, diminished and retreating at its edges, but the Amazon at its most ancient and overwhelming, an unbroken canopy stretching across millions of square miles, a living world so dense and so layered that sunlight rarely reaches the forest floor. Rivers the color of dark tea wind through it without maps. Insects move in clouds. The air itself feels alive, pressing against you with heat and moisture and the constant indifferent noise of an ecosystem that has no interest in human ambition. It was into this world that Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett walked in the spring of 1925, and it was here that he, his son Jack, and their companion Raleigh Ramel disappeared without a trace. Fawcett was not an ordinary man, even by the extraordinary standards of the Edwardian explorer. A decorated British Army officer, a surveyor, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, he had spent years mapping the unmapped borders of South America, work of genuine scientific value, conducted in conditions that would have broken most men. He was methodical, physically formidable, and deeply serious about his craft. But he was also a man gripped by something that went beyond conventional scholarship. He believed in the existence of a lost city. He called it simply Z. The idea had grown in him over years of fieldwork, fed by fragments, indigenous oral traditions that spoke of great cities in the interior, ancient pottery of unusual sophistication recovered from the jungle floor, colonial-era documents describing settlements of remarkable size and complexity deep in the Amazon. To the academic establishment of his time, the Amazon was considered incapable of supporting advanced civilization. The soil was too poor, the environment too hostile. The idea of a great lost city in the jungle was, to most serious scholars, romantic nonsense. Fawcett disagreed, and in 1925 he staked everything on that disagreement. He departed with his son and Ramel from the town of Cuiabá in Brazil, heading into the Mato Grosso, a region whose very name, meaning thick bush or dense forest, speaks to its character. He sent back several dispatches as he traveled deeper into the interior. The last letter, written in late May 1925, described high spirits and a sense of imminent discovery. Then the letters stopped. No confirmed trace of Fawcett, his son, or Ramel has ever been found. What followed his disappearance was, in its own way, almost as remarkable as the disappearance itself. Over the subsequent decades, more than 100 people died attempting to find him. Explorers, adventurers, and journalists consumed by the same jungle that had taken Fawcett. The Amazon does not give back what it takes, and it charges a price simply for the attempt. The mainstream explanations are sober and probably correct in their broad outlines. The Amazon in 1925 was extraordinarily dangerous to outsiders. Disease, starvation, hostile indigenous groups protecting their territory from repeated encroachment by violent and exploitative outsiders. Fawcett was experienced, but experience is not immunity. Many researchers believe the expedition almost certainly perished from some combination of these factors, their remains long since reclaimed by a jungle that dismantles everything with patient efficiency. Several indigenous communities in the region have, over the years, claimed knowledge of Fawcett's fate, accounts of white men captured, killed, or absorbed into local populations. Some of these testimonies were collected by subsequent expeditions and presented as near conclusive. None proved definitive. The stories shifted, contradicted each other, and resisted the kind of verification that history requires. In 2005, a document surfaced purporting to be a confession from a Kalapalo elder, claiming that his people had killed Fawcett after the explorer ignored warnings about hostile territory ahead. The account was detailed and internally consistent. It also could not be independently confirmed, and other researchers disputed its authenticity and interpretation. The mystery absorbed this too, as it had absorbed everything else. And then, in the years that followed Fawcett's disappearance, something unexpected began to emerge from the jungle. Not a city, but evidence that changed the entire framework of the question. Archaeological surveys using LiDAR technology, which maps terrain beneath the forest canopy using laser pulses from aircraft, began to reveal geometric earthworks, roads, and settlement patterns of remarkable sophistication across large areas of the Amazon. The academic consensus that the jungle could not support complex civilization began to crack and then to crumble. It is now broadly accepted that pre-Columbian Amazonia was home to populations and social structures far more complex than previously imagined. Fawcett, it turns out, may not have been entirely wrong. Not a single lost city, perhaps. But something. A world the jungle had hidden, layer by layer, for centuries. Which raises a question that sits quietly beneath all the others. Did Fawcett find something? Not necessarily the gleaming city of his imagination, but evidence, ruins, earthworks, the unmistakable geometry of human intention in the landscape. And if he did, what happened in the moment of that discovery? His last letter spoke of optimism and forward momentum. It gave no indication of danger or doubt. Whatever came next came without warning. Somewhere in the Mato Grosso, beneath decades of growth and silence, the answer may still exist, buried under roots and soil and the slow, relentless work of a jungle that keeps its secrets with extraordinary patience. Percy Fawcett walked toward something he had spent his life believing in. Did he find it? And if he did, does any trace of that discovery still remain, waiting for the right person to look in exactly the right place? The jungle swallowed Percy Fawcett and kept its silence. But disappearances do not only happen in places of heat and density and overwhelming life. Sometimes the cold takes things just as completely. Picture the southwestern coast of Greenland in the early 11th century. It is not the barren, ice-locked wasteland that the name might suggest. Not here, not yet. The fjords cut deep into the land, sheltered and surprisingly temperate by the standards of the North Atlantic. Grass grows along the water's edge. The soil, thin but workable, yields enough for small farms. Seals move through the gray water in numbers that seem almost inexhaustible. To a Norse settler arriving from Iceland, it would have looked, improbably perhaps, like a place where life could be built. And for nearly 500 years it was. The Norse settlement of Greenland began around 985 AD, led by Eric the Red, a man exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, which says something both about the man and about the world that produced him. He brought with him several hundred settlers, and over the following generations, 2 main colonies took root along Greenland's southwestern fjords. The eastern settlement, the larger of the two, eventually grew to support several thousand people, a cathedral, a bishop's seat, and a network of farms that stretched across the available land. The western settlement, smaller and further north, was a quieter outpost at the edge of the known world. At its peak, the Greenland Norse community was a functioning, connected part of medieval European civilization, paying tithes to the church in Rome, trading walrus ivory and furs to European markets, maintaining correspondence with Norway and Iceland. These were not isolated survivors clinging to existence. They were participants in a wider world. And then, sometime in the mid to late 15th century, they were gone. The western settlement appears to have been abandoned first, sometime around the mid-14th century. When a Norse expedition arrived to investigate the silence, they found empty farms, livestock wandering untended, and no people. The eastern settlement persisted longer. The last written record of the Greenland Norse dates to 1408, a marriage recorded at Valsey Church, described in enough domestic detail to feel achingly ordinary. A wedding, 2 people, witnesses, the careful notation of a community still functioning, still observing its rituals and its records. After that, silence. No final letter, no explanation, no account of what happened in the years that followed. Just the gradual cessation of all contact, and farmsteads that archaeology now finds frozen in a particular moment. Tools set down, objects left behind, the material residue of lives interrupted or concluded without ceremony. Climate is the explanation that carries the most scholarly weight, and with good reason. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland marginally hospitable began to give way, from roughly the 13th century onward to the conditions now known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, the growing season shortened, Sea ice expanded, making the already difficult North Atlantic crossing increasingly treacherous and eventually cutting the colonies off from reliable contact with Europe. The land that had been marginal became punishing. Crops that had barely grown stopped growing entirely. But climate alone does not fully satisfy the question. The Inuit peoples, the Thule culture, who had been moving into Greenland from the north during precisely this period, adapted and survived the same cooling temperatures. They had the tools, the knowledge, and the cultural practices suited to Arctic conditions. The Norse did not, or would not, adopt them. This is where the mystery deepens. Archaeological evidence suggests the Greenland Norse were remarkably resistant to adaptation. Despite living alongside or near Inuit populations for generations, they appear to have adopted almost none of the survival technologies that made Arctic life viable. The kayak, the harpoon designed for seal hunting through ice, the clothing constructed from layered animal skins. They continued to farm, to raise cattle, to maintain the material culture of medieval European Christianity, even as that culture became increasingly unsuited to their environment. Why? The question has no clean answer. Some researchers point to social and religious identity, that to adopt Inuit practices was, in the Norse worldview, to abandon what made them Norse, what made them Christian, what connected them to the European civilization they understood themselves to be part of. Cultural identity, held too rigidly, can become a survival liability. Others suggest the relationship between the Norse and the Inuit was not peaceful coexistence, but active conflict. There is archaeological evidence of Norse settlements showing signs of raid and violence, and some Inuit oral traditions speak of encounters with the Kavlunite, the Norse, that were far from friendly. Whether conflict contributed meaningfully to the colony's end remains debated. And then there is a quieter theory, less dramatic, but perhaps more human, that the colonists did not perish catastrophically, but simply left. That as conditions worsened and contact with Europe grew rare, families made the calculation that survival meant departure, boarding whatever ships were available, returning to Iceland or Norway, melting back into populations that left no record of their Greenlandic origins. A colony does not have to die violently to disappear. It can simply drain away, person by person, season by season, until the last remaining inhabitants face the silence of abandoned farms and make the only decision left to them. The church at Valsey still stands, in partial ruin, on the edge of a Greenlandic fjord. Its stone walls have outlasted everyone who built them, everyone who prayed within them, everyone who witnessed that last recorded wedding in 1408. It stands in a landscape that is now, once again, changing. The ice retreating, the temperatures rising, the fjords opening in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the people who once farmed their edges. 500 years of human life in one of the world's most remote places. And in the end, not even a farewell. Just stone walls and silence. And the question of whether those last remaining settlers looked back as they left, or whether, by then, there was nothing left worth looking back at. The Norse walked away from Greenland and left stone walls standing in the silence. But not every disappearance is quiet. Some arrive with fire first. Cast your mind back, far back, to the eastern Mediterranean in the decades surrounding 1200 BC. We have been here before, at the opening of this journey, watching the Bronze Age world unravel at its seams. But there is a thread we left deliberately loose, a presence that moved through that collapsing world like a shadow across water, striking without warning, vanishing without explanation, and leaving behind a question that archaeologists and historians have wrestled with for over a century. The Sea Peoples. Picture the coastline of Egypt in 1177 BC. The Nile Delta, flat and vast, where the great river fans out into the Mediterranean in a sprawl of channels and marshland. It is here that Rameses III, one of the last great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, claims to have fought and won a decisive battle against a confederation of invaders unlike anything Egypt had faced before. The encounter is recorded on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, one of the most detailed military records to survive from the ancient world. The carvings are extraordinary: ships locked in combat on open water, soldiers in feathered headdresses, bodies in the waves, and accompanying text that describes the invaders in terms of almost cosmic threat, a force that had already destroyed the Hittites, overrun Cyprus, burned the cities of the Levantine coast, and now turned its attention toward Egypt itself. Rameses claims victory. Egypt, he says, held. But the Sea Peoples, whoever they were, had already changed the world beyond recovery. The identities of the Sea Peoples remain one of archaeology's most stubbornly unresolved puzzles. Egyptian records give us names: the Peliset, the Chakar, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, rendered in hieroglyphics that offer sounds, but not origins. Scholars have spent generations attempting to map these names onto known or suspected populations, and the results remain contested. The Peliset are widely associated with the Philistines, a people who appear in the archaeological and textual record along the southern Levantine coast, the region of modern-day southern Palestine, shortly after the Bronze Age collapse. The connection is linguistically plausible and archaeologically supported in certain respects, though not all researchers accept it without qualification. Others have proposed Aegean origins for various Sea Peoples groups: displaced Mycenaeans, migrants from Cyprus, populations uprooted from the Greek islands by the same cascading crises that were dismantling the Bronze Age from within. Some researchers have looked further west, to Anatolia, to Sicily, to Sardinia, finding in local names and traditions possible echoes of the Egyptian designations. The Shekelesh perhaps in Sicily, the Danaan in the region of ancient Cilicia. These connections are suggestive rather than proven, and the scholarly debate around them has never reached anything close to resolution. What makes the Sea Peoples particularly difficult to pin down is that they do not appear to have been a single unified people at all. The Egyptian records describe a coalition, different groups moving together, some by sea, some by land, accompanied by ox carts carrying women, children, and household goods. This was not simply a raiding party. It had the character of a migration, entire communities in motion, carrying their lives with them, looking not just to plunder, but to settle. Where had they come from? And why were they moving? The most widely accepted framework places the Sea Peoples within the broader context of the Bronze Age collapse itself, as both contributors to and victims of the cascading system failure we explored at the beginning of this journey. Climate disruption, drought, famine, and the breakdown of the interconnected trade networks that sustained Bronze Age civilization may have set entire populations in motion across the Mediterranean simultaneously. The Sea Peoples, in this reading, were not so much an outside force destroying a stable world as one symptom among many of a world already destroying itself. But this framework, compelling as it is, does not fully explain the sudden and dramatic nature of their appearance, or, crucially, their disappearance. Because that is the other half of the mystery. The Sea Peoples arrive in the historical record with devastating force, reshaping the eastern Mediterranean within the space of a few decades. And then they are simply gone, not gradually absorbed, not slowly defeated. They recede from the record with almost the same abruptness with which they entered it. What happened to them? The mainstream answer is assimilation, that the various groups settled in the regions they had reached, blending into local populations and losing the characteristics that had made them identifiable as a distinct force. The Philistines, in this reading, are the most visible remnant of that process. A Sea Peoples group that put down roots and became, over generations, a settled culture with its own distinct material identity. But assimilation does not account for all the groups, or fully explain the speed and completeness of the transition. Some researchers have proposed that the Sea Peoples coalition, like all coalitions of necessity, simply fractured once the immediate pressures that had driven them together were removed or transformed. Without a common crisis forcing unity, the different groups went their separate ways, some settling, some continuing to move, some perhaps returning to homelands that archaeology has not yet identified. The temple walls at Medinet Habu preserve them in frozen motion, feathered helmets, raised spears, ships caught in the moment of battle. It is one of the most vivid images of the ancient world. And yet the people depicted in those carvings remain, in the most fundamental sense, unknown. We have their silhouettes. We have the damage they left behind, burned cities, abandoned ports, the sudden silence of trade routes that had operated for centuries. But we do not have their story. Not in their own words, not from their own perspective. Somewhere, perhaps, that story still exists, in an unexcavated site, in a language not yet fully understood, in the ground beneath a coastline that has not yet given up what it holds. Who were they really? And why did they vanish as completely as the world they helped to end? The sea peoples moved through a warm sea and vanished into history. But cold, as we have seen in Greenland, has its own way of erasing things. And few erasures have been as complete, or as haunting, as what happened in the Arctic in the years following 1845. Picture the waters of the Canadian Arctic archipelago in high summer. On the surface, there is a brief, deceptive beauty to it. Low golden light stretching across the horizon for 20 hours a day. The water dark and still between islands of gray rock and ancient ice. Polar bears move along the shoreline. Arctic foxes pick through the shallows. It is a landscape of extraordinary, stripped-down power. But beneath that beauty is a place of almost incomprehensible hostility to human life. The ice that retreats in summer returns in autumn with a patience and a force that no wooden ship, however well built, can ultimately resist. It was into this world that Sir John Franklin sailed in May 1845, commanding two of the most technologically advanced vessels of the Victorian era, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. 129 men in total. The mission was one of the most ambitious in the history of exploration. The completion of the Northwest Passage, the long-sought navigable route through the Arctic waters connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Britain was confident. The ships were reinforced against ice, equipped with steam engines, loaded with 3 years of provisions. Franklin himself was a veteran of Arctic exploration, a decorated officer, a man of considerable reputation. The expedition departed to public admiration and official optimism. It was never seen again. Not intact, not alive. The last confirmed sighting of Erebus and Terror came from European whalers in late July 1845 at the entrance to Lancaster Sound. The ships were waiting for conditions to improve, moored to an iceberg. The crews appeared in good health and good spirits. Then they sailed north and west into the Arctic interior, and the silence that followed stretched into months, and then into years. By 1847, concern was beginning to build in London. By 1848, it had become alarm. The first search expeditions were dispatched. They found nothing. More followed. Over the next decade, more than 30 separate expeditions would search for Franklin, making the effort to locate him one of the largest search operations in the history of exploration. Some were driven by genuine humanitarian concern. Others were motivated by the considerable prize money offered by the Admiralty. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, became one of the most persistent and effective advocates for the search, funding expeditions herself when official interest began to wane. The first real evidence emerged in 1850, a winter camp on Beechey Island, and 3 graves. 3 of Franklin's men, buried in the first winter of the expedition, 1845 to 1846. The graves were marked. The bodies, when later exhumed, were remarkably well preserved by the permafrost. And they told a disturbing story. Analysis conducted in the 20th century revealed elevated levels of lead in the men's tissue, possibly from the soldered tin cans that made up a significant portion of the expedition's food supply. Lead poisoning, insidious and cumulative, affects cognition, decision-making, and physical health in ways that would have been invisible to Victorian medicine, but catastrophic to men relying on clear judgment in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The most significant written record came in 1859, when a search party led by Francis McClintock discovered a cairn on King William Island containing a single document, a standard Admiralty form, filled in twice. The first entry, dated May 1847, was routine and optimistic. Franklin was alive. The ships were beset in ice, but the situation appeared manageable. The second entry, written in the margins 11 months later, told a different story entirely. Franklin had died in June 1847. The ships had been trapped in the ice for a year and a half. 24 officers and men were already dead. The surviving 105 men had abandoned the ships and were marching south toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland, hoping to reach safety overland. None of them made it. The physical and forensic evidence gathered over subsequent decades, from Inuit oral accounts, from scattered bones and equipment found across King William Island and the surrounding area, paints a picture of a long, desperate, and ultimately fatal retreat across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Scurvy, starvation, hypothermia, and the cumulative effects of lead poisoning likely combined to destroy the expedition man by man across months of increasingly desperate marching. Inuit testimonies collected by searchers in the years following the disaster described encounters with groups of gaunt, stumbling men pulling sledges across the ice. They described finding bodies. They described, in accounts that disturbed Victorian sensibilities enough to be initially suppressed, evidence of cannibalism among the final survivors. A detail that forensic analysis of recovered bones has since confirmed. The ships themselves remained missing until the 21st century. HMS Erebus was located in 2014, resting on the floor of Queen Maud Gulf. HMS Terror was found 2 years later in Terror Bay, a name that preceded the discovery by over a century, drawn from Inuit knowledge that had always known something lay beneath those waters. The ships are remarkably well preserved. Exploration of their interiors has revealed objects in place, drawers still closed, the physical remnants of ordered Victorian life preserved in the cold dark of the Arctic seabed. And yet they have also raised new questions. Terror, in particular, appears to have been carefully anchored rather than simply abandoned, suggesting that some of the crew may have returned to the ship after the initial abandonment, perhaps attempting to overwinter once more before the end came. Who returned? How many? And what did those final weeks or months look like, in the darkness of an Arctic winter, aboard a ship locked in ice with no possibility of rescue? The cold preserved the ships. It preserved the graves on Beechy Island. It preserved, in Inuit memory, fragments of a story that official history was slow to acknowledge. But the full account of what happened, the decisions made, the hopes held and abandoned, the last days of the last survivors, remains beyond reach. 129 men sailed into the Arctic and did not come back. The ice knew where they went, and in its own slow time, it has begun to show us. But has it shown us everything? The Arctic gave up its secrets slowly, piece by piece, ship by ship, across a century and a half of searching. Some mysteries yield that way, gradually, reluctantly, in fragments that almost form a picture. Others refuse to yield at all. Picture the lowland jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula in the 9th century AD, not the cleared and mapped landscape of today, but a world of almost unimaginable density. Vast forest stretching in every direction, broken only by the soaring stone pyramids and temple complexes of one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient Americas ever produced. From a distance, those structures rise above the canopy like monuments to permanence itself. Carved staircases, astronomical observatories aligned to the movements of Venus and the Sun, reservoirs engineered to sustain cities of tens of thousands through seasons of drought, hieroglyphic texts recording histories, prophecies, and genealogies in a script of breathtaking complexity. This was the Maya at the height of the classic period, a civilization that had flourished for centuries, that understood mathematics well enough to conceive of zero, that tracked celestial cycles with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. And then, between roughly 800 and 950 AD, the great southern lowland cities were abandoned. One by one, the royal courts fell silent. The construction of monumental architecture stopped, abruptly, in the middle of projects, as if the workforce simply walked away mid-task. The last dated monument in the southern lowlands was erected in 909 AD. After that, the stone calendar goes quiet. The jungle moved in. Within generations, trees were growing through palace floors. What happened to the classic Maya is one of the most intensely studied questions in archaeology, and one that still resists a single, clean answer. The civilization did not disappear entirely, and this distinction matters. The Maya did not vanish the way the Bronze Age palace cultures vanished, completely, leaving only ruins and silence. Maya people survived, adapted, and continued in the northern Yucatan and the highlands of Guatemala. Their descendants are alive today, millions of them, maintaining languages and traditions that connect directly to the classic period world. What collapsed was not a people, but a particular form of political and urban organization. The city-state system of the southern lowlands, with its divine kings, its monumental architecture, and its intricate web of competing dynasties. That distinction noted, the collapse of that system was still dramatic, still profound, and still not fully explained. Climate sits at the center of the mainstream explanation, and the evidence supporting it is substantial. Paleoclimatic data drawn from lake sediments, stalagmites, and ancient pollen deposits across the Yucatan region reveals a pattern of severe, prolonged droughts during precisely the period of collapse, particularly between 800 and 1000 AD. The Maya agricultural system, ingenious as it was, depended heavily on rainfall. The great lowland cities had no rivers. They survived on rainwater collected in reservoirs and managed through sophisticated hydraulic engineering. Remove the rain consistently enough, for long enough, and even the most sophisticated water management system reaches its limits. Drought triggers food scarcity. Food scarcity generates social stress. Social stress in a system built around divine kingship, where the ruler's legitimacy rested partly on his ability to intercede with the gods for rain and abundance, becomes political crisis with remarkable speed. When the rains stop coming, the king's authority begins to dissolve with them. But drought alone does not explain everything. The archaeological record across the southern lowland sites shows evidence of something more than environmental pressure. There is widespread evidence of warfare, intensifying conflict between city-states, sieges, the destruction of monuments, the deliberate erasure of royal imagery. Some sites show signs of violent assault. Others appear to have been abandoned more gradually, as populations dispersed into smaller, more sustainable settlements in the surrounding countryside. Some researchers have pointed to internal social upheaval, the possibility that the elaborate hierarchy of classic Maya society, with its enormous demands on commoner populations for labor, tribute, and military service, generated the conditions for its own collapse from below. Elite competition for resources in an era of environmental stress may have accelerated warfare, while simultaneously depleting the agricultural surpluses that sustained urban populations. There is also the matter of deforestation. The Maya cleared enormous areas of forest to fuel the lime plaster production that coated their monumental buildings, a single structure requiring the burning of vast quantities of wood. Over centuries, this deforestation may have altered local rainfall patterns, creating a feedback loop in which the very act of building the civilization gradually undermined the environmental conditions that made it possible. And then there are the less conventional threads. A small number of researchers have proposed epidemic disease as a contributing factor. Populations already weakened by drought and conflict made catastrophically vulnerable to illness. Others have pointed to evidence of a prolonged disruption in trade networks that connected the lowland cities to resources and prestige goods from distant regions, suggesting that the collapse was partly economic before it became political or demographic. None of these explanations individually closes the question. Together, they form a picture of multiple pressures converging on a system that had, perhaps, already stretched itself to its limits. a civilization at the edge of what its environment and its social structures could sustain, waiting for the combination of factors that would finally prove too much. Tikal, once home to perhaps 90,000 people, was largely abandoned by the 10th century. Its pyramids stood in silence for centuries before the jungle covered them so completely that 19th century explorers walked past them, mistaking them for natural hills. The forest hid what the Maya had built, and for 1,000 years those structures waited, patient as stone, patient as roots, for someone to come looking. We have been looking ever since. And with every excavation, every LiDAR survey, every sediment core pulled from the bed of an ancient lake, we find new layers of complexity beneath the question we thought we understood. The Maya built something extraordinary, and then, in ways that still elude complete explanation, they stepped back from it. Why, in the end, did the kings stop building? And what did the last inhabitants of those great cities see as the forest began its slow return? The Maya stepped back from their cities and left the jungle to reclaim what they had built. Their ending, however incomplete our understanding of it, unfolded across decades, a slow withdrawal, a gradual silence. Some mysteries are not slow at all. Some happen in a single night. Picture the eastern slopes of the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union in the first days of February 1959. It is winter in one of the coldest inhabited regions on Earth. The temperature drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius after dark. The wind moves across the open snowfields with a force that strips exposed skin in minutes. There are no trees at the higher elevations, just vast, white, featureless slopes stretching upward into a sky that in winter rarely fully brightens. It is a landscape of profound, indifferent hostility. Into this landscape, on the 1st of February 1959, walked 9 experienced young hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They were led by Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a skilled and careful expedition leader. The group included students and graduates, men and women, all of them seasoned in winter hiking. Their goal was to reach the summit of Otterton, a mountain in the northern Urals. It was a challenging route, rated at the highest difficulty level for Soviet hiking expeditions at the time. But these were not novices. They had the equipment, the experience, and the preparation the journey demanded. They made camp on the slopes of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kolatshakal. In the Mansi language, the name means dead mountain. None of them survived the night. When the group failed to return on schedule and no communication had been received, a search party was dispatched. They found the tent on February 26th, and what they found made no immediate sense. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not unzipped, cut with a knife from within, as if the occupants had needed to exit with extreme urgency and could not afford the seconds it would take to use the entrance. The belongings of all 9 hikers were still inside. Their boots, their outer clothing, their equipment. In the snow outside, leading away from the tent and down the slope, were footprints. 9 sets, moving in an organized, deliberate manner, not running, not panicking, but walking away from the tent in the bitter cold, without adequate clothing, without boots in most cases, in the darkness of a February night in the Urals. The bodies were found in stages over the following weeks and months. The first 5 were recovered relatively quickly, scattered across the slope below the tent, some near a makeshift fire, some apparently attempting to return toward the tent when death overtook them. Hypothermia was the obvious explanation for these 5. They had fled the tent inadequately dressed into lethal cold, and the cold had killed them. But the other 4 were found later, buried under several meters of snow in a ravine further from the tent, and their deaths were different in ways that the initial investigation could not explain. 2 of them had suffered catastrophic internal injuries, fractured ribs, a fractured skull, consistent with the kind of massive compressive force produced by a serious car accident or an industrial incident. But there was no external bruising to suggest a blow from outside. One was missing her tongue, her eyes, tissue around her mouth. The Soviet investigators attributed this to natural decomposition and the activity of predators in the weeks the body lay undiscovered. Not everyone found that explanation satisfying. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force, a phrase so vague as to be almost meaningless, and one that satisfied nobody. The case was closed, the files were classified, and the mountain kept its silence for decades. The mainstream explanation that has gained the most traction in recent years centers on a phenomenon called a slab avalanche, specifically a delayed action snow slab that may have partially collapsed onto the tent hours after the hikers set up camp. This would explain the decision to cut their way out rapidly, the organized nature of the retreat, and the severe compressive injuries sustained by some of the group. A 2021 study used forensic modeling to demonstrate that the injuries were consistent with snow loading rather than human violence. But slab avalanches do not explain everything. The slope where the tent was pitched was not considered avalanche-prone by the searchers who examined it. No avalanche debris was found near the tent, and the behavior of the group, moving away from the tent in an organized manner and then separating into smaller groups rather than staying together for warmth, remains difficult to account for through avalanche alone. Other theories have accumulated over 6 decades of investigation. An infrasound hypothesis suggests that wind moving across the mountain's particular topography may have generated low-frequency sound waves capable of producing panic, disorientation, and acute psychological distress, a phenomenon documented in other contexts, but difficult to prove retrospectively. Military testing in the region has been proposed. The Urals were a significant zone of Soviet weapons development in the 1950s, and some researchers have pointed to unusual attributes of the scene, including reported orange spheres observed in the sky above the region around the time of the incident by other hikers and meteorological stations, as evidence of something connected to military activity. The Soviet classification of the files, maintained for decades, has fed speculation about concealment. What, if anything, the Soviet authorities knew or suspected has never been fully clarified. The mountain was renamed after Igor Dyatlov. His name now marks the place where he and his companions spent their last night, a small, permanent memorial in the landscape that took them. 9 experienced, careful people cut their way out of a tent in the middle of a February night and walked into lethal cold. The evidence tells us what happened to their bodies. It does not tell us, with any certainty, what made them do it. What did they hear? What did they see? What, in those first moments of darkness outside the tent, was frightening enough to make experienced mountaineers choose the cold over whatever was behind them? The Dyatlov Pass gives us 9 people and 1 night and a question that may never be fully answered. The evidence is there. The tent, the footprints, the injuries, and still the picture refuses to complete itself. But sometimes history preserves not just the mystery of an ending, but the ending itself, frozen in extraordinary detail, sealed beneath the earth, waiting for someone to dig carefully enough to find it. Picture the island of Thera in the southern Aegean Sea, sometime around 1600 BC. It is a different world from the one we inhabit now, a circular island, fertile and temperate, rising gently from deep blue water. On its southern coast sits a town of remarkable sophistication. Multi-story buildings line narrow streets. Drainage systems run beneath the lanes. The walls of the interior rooms are covered in vivid frescoes, painted with a confidence and artistry that speaks of a culture at ease with beauty, accustomed to abundance. Blue monkeys climb painted cliffs. Antelopes move across ochre landscapes. A young boy boxes, his fists raised, his expression calm and focused. Fishermen carry the day's catch. This is Akrotiri, and it is about to be destroyed so completely, so violently, that it will remain buried and forgotten for 3,500 years. The volcano that sits at the center of Thera, known today as Santorini, was not merely a volcanic eruption. It was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The Minoan eruption, as it is known, expelled an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in context, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which reshaped the landscape of the American Pacific Northwest and sent ash across the continent, expelled roughly 1 cubic kilometer. The Thera eruption was many times larger than anything the modern world has directly experienced. It collapsed the central portion of the island into the sea, creating a caldera, the dramatic cliff-ringed harbor that defines Santorini's famous silhouette today, and generated tsunamis that radiated across the eastern Mediterranean with devastating force. The ash cloud reached the stratosphere. Climate records preserved in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show a clear volcanic signal consistent with a massive mid-second millennium BC eruption. Tree ring data from across the northern hemisphere records a period of anomalous cooling in the years following, the signature of a sun partially blocked by volcanic debris. And beneath the ash that settled over Akrotiri, the town was preserved with a completeness that archaeology rarely encounters. When excavations began in the 1960s under the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, what emerged from the volcanic layers was not ruin in the conventional sense, not the gradual decay of abandoned structures, but a snapshot. A town caught in the moment before catastrophe, its objects in place, its architecture intact to the roof lines in some areas, its art preserved in colors that still carry the warmth and confidence of the civilization that created them. There is something deeply affecting about Akrotiri. Walking through its excavated streets is not like visiting a ruin. It is like visiting a pause, a moment held suspended, waiting for the people who lived there to return and resume. But those people had already gone, and this is where the mystery deepens in an unexpected direction. Unlike Pompeii, that later and better-known volcanic catastrophe, Akrotiri contains no human remains, no bodies, no bones. No one caught in the act of fleeing, preserved in ash the way Pompeii's victims were preserved in pyroclastic material. The people of Akrotiri had warning. Seismic activity preceding a major volcanic eruption is almost always significant. Tremors, ground deformation, the smell of sulfur, changes in local springs and water sources. The inhabitants of Akrotiri appear to have read those warnings and acted on them. They left in advance of the final eruption, taking with them, it seems, most of their valuables. The gold and silver that an affluent Bronze Age community would have accumulated. What they left behind were the things too heavy or too fixed to carry. The furniture, the storage jars, the frescoes on the walls. They left, and they survived. At least in the immediate term. But where did they go? This question has no answer that archaeology has yet provided. The population of Akrotiri, estimated in the thousands, dispersed into a Bronze Age Mediterranean world that was itself, as we have seen, already under various forms of stress. They may have reached Crete, the dominant power of the region, whose Minoan civilization shared clear cultural connections with Thera. They may have scattered to other Aegean islands, to the coasts of the mainland, to Cyprus or the Levant. No refugee community from Thera has been positively identified in the archaeological record. The eruption's broader effects are a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. Some researchers have argued that the tsunamis and ashfall generated by the Thera event contributed to the decline of Minoan Crete, disrupting agriculture and coastal settlements sufficiently to weaken a civilization already under pressure. Others dispute the timing and the causal chain, noting that the chronology of the eruption relative to Minoan decline is difficult to establish with precision. The debate about the exact date of the eruption, which hinges on the interpretation of ice core and radiocarbon data, has not been fully resolved, with estimates ranging across roughly a century. And then there is the older, more persistent question that Thera and its catastrophic eruption have inspired for generations. Plato, writing in the 4th century BC, described a powerful island civilization in the Atlantic that was destroyed in a single day and night by a catastrophic natural event and sank beneath the ocean. His account of Atlantis has been analyzed, debated, dismissed, and revisited across 2.5 millennia. Did the memory of Thera, the island that exploded, that collapsed into the sea, that sent its people fleeing across the Mediterranean, find its way, transformed and amplified by centuries of retelling, into Plato's account? No serious scholar treats the Atlantis question as straightforward. But the connection between a real volcanic catastrophe of extraordinary scale and a philosophical myth about civilizational destruction is not one that can be entirely dismissed either. Beneath the streets of Akrotiri, the painted boy still raises his fists. The fishermen still carry their catch. The blue monkeys still climb their painted cliffs, frozen in a moment that the volcano sealed with ash and preserved for 35 centuries. The people who made those images escaped. But the world they escaped into, where did it take them? And is it possible that somewhere, in the records of another civilization, the memory of what they witnessed still survives? Akrotiri's people read the warnings written in the earth and chose to leave. They made a decision, deliberate, organized, considered, and they acted on it in time. But not every abandonment is chosen. Not every departure is planned. Sometimes people simply vanish from a place they had no intention of leaving. Picture the North Atlantic Ocean in late November 1872. The sea in this part of the world at this time of year is rarely kind. Gray water under gray sky, long swells rolling in from the west, the wind carrying a cold that settles into the bones of anyone exposed to it for long enough. Merchant vessels cross these waters in a state of permanent negotiation with the ocean, their crews experienced in the rhythms of Atlantic passage, attuned to weather and wind, and the thousand small signals that experienced sailors read without conscious thought. On the 4th of December 1872, the British brigantine Dei Gratia was making its way eastward toward Gibraltar when its crew spotted another vessel approximately 600 miles west of the Portuguese coast. The ship was moving erratically, not sailing with purpose, but yawing and drifting, her sails in partial disarray. To experienced eyes, something was immediately wrong. The Dei Gratia altered course to investigate. The ship was the Mary Celeste, an American brigantine, well-built and seaworthy, that had departed New York on the 7th of November bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. On board had been the captain, Benjamin Briggs, an experienced and respected mariner, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7 experienced sailors. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia climbed onto the Mary Celeste, they found her in a condition that has been generating questions ever since. The ship was fundamentally intact and seaworthy. Her cargo was undisturbed. The crew's personal belongings were in place: clothing, pipes, personal effects, the small accumulated objects of men at sea. The ship's papers were missing, along with the chronometer and the sextant. The lifeboat was gone. And the last entry in the ship's log was dated November 25th, placing the vessel near the Azores Islands, some 400 miles from where she was found. 10 people had been on board the Mary Celeste when she left New York. Not one of them was ever found. The condition of the ship generated immediate and lasting fascination because it suggested, so powerfully, not disaster, but interruption. Meals have been described as half-eaten on the table, a detail that has been repeated so often it has become myth, though the actual evidence for it is more ambiguous than the legend suggests. What is documented is the general impression of a vessel abandoned in haste, but without obvious cause. No fire, no sign of violence, no structural damage that would have demanded immediate evacuation. The cargo was intact. The hull was sound. Why would 10 people leave a seaworthy ship in the middle of the North Atlantic and take to an open lifeboat? The official inquiry conducted in Gibraltar reached no definitive conclusion. The presiding official, Frederick Solly Flood, suspected foul play, specifically that the crew of the Dei Gratia might have been involved in some arrangement with the Mary Celeste's crew, motivated by the substantial salvage claim the Dei Gratia stood to collect. The suspicion was never substantiated. The crew of the Dei Gratia received a reduced salvage award, apparently reflecting the court's lingering unease, but no charges were ever brought. The mainstream explanation that has attracted the most scholarly support over the years centers on the cargo. 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol is a volatile load. If vapor had been building in the hold, which it very plausibly could, given the nature of the cargo and the conditions of the voyage, an inspection of the hold might have revealed evidence of a pressure buildup alarming enough to suggest imminent explosion. Captain Briggs, experienced and cautious, may have made the decision to evacuate the ship temporarily, intending to allow the hold to ventilate while the crew waited at a safe distance on the lifeboat, connected to the Mary Celeste by a tow rope. The tow rope, in this scenario, parted. The wind caught the Mary Celeste and moved her faster than an overloaded lifeboat could follow. The distance between the ship and the lifeboat grew, and somewhere in the gray Atlantic in late November, the lifeboat and everyone aboard it were lost to weather and sea. It is a plausible sequence. It fits the known evidence reasonably well, and it has the quality of a genuine maritime tragedy. A reasonable decision made by an experienced captain, undone by circumstance and the indifferent mechanics of wind and water. But it remains a reconstruction, not a fact, not a testimony, just the most coherent story that fits the available pieces. Other theories have circulated for a century and a half. Waterspouts, sudden, violent columns of rotating water capable of terrifying a crew into panicked evacuation. Seaquakes, submarine earthquakes capable of generating sensations on the surface that might convince a crew their vessel was breaking apart, even when it was structurally sound. Piracy, though no evidence of external violence was found. Insurance fraud, though Briggs himself had a financial stake in the cargo that made deliberate abandonment economically irrational. And then there are the stranger suggestions, the ones that live at the edges of serious inquiry and occasionally surface in popular accounts. Giant squid. Sudden appearance of a mysterious island. The earliest suggestions of what would later become the mythology of the Bermuda Triangle, though the Mary Celeste was found nowhere near that region, and the geographic connection is entirely fictional. These theories say more about human discomfort with incomplete explanations than they do about what happened on the North Atlantic in November 1872. When the evidence is insufficient, imagination fills the space. It always has. What is known, with certainty, is this. The Mary Celeste sailed on without her people, found her way across hundreds of miles of open ocean, and delivered herself, crewless, childless, silent, into the hands of strangers who could make no more sense of her condition than we can today. Benjamin Briggs had sailed these waters before. He knew the Atlantic. He was not a reckless man. He brought his wife and his daughter aboard because he believed, based on everything he knew, that the voyage was safe. Whatever changed his mind happened between November 25th and December 4th, somewhere in the waters between the Azores and the Portuguese coast. The ocean kept that secret completely, and the Mary Celeste herself, which sailed on for 12 more years under different owners before being deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti in 1885, never offered a single clue about what she had witnessed. Did Benjamin Briggs make the right call in those final moments of decision on the North Atlantic? And is it possible that, somewhere in the deep water between the Azores and Gibraltar, the answer to one of the sea's most enduring questions still rests, beyond reach, beyond light, beyond recovery? The Mary Celeste drifted across the Atlantic without her people, carrying a silence that the ocean never explained. The sea, vast and indifferent, swallowed whatever happened and moved on. But the sky can swallow things too, and occasionally the sky delivers something in return. Picture the remote Siberian taiga in the early morning of June 30th, 1908. This is one of the most isolated places on Earth, a seemingly endless expanse of coniferous forest stretching across millions of square kilometers, broken by rivers, swamp, and the occasional small settlement of indigenous Evenki people who have lived in relationship with this landscape for generations. The nearest city of any significance is hundreds of miles away. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed only a few years earlier, runs far to the south. In the taiga itself, in the summer of 1908, there are virtually no outside witnesses, no instruments, no observers positioned to record what is about to happen. At approximately 7:17 in the morning, something entered the Earth's atmosphere above central Siberia. What followed was the largest impact event in recorded human history. The explosion, for that is what it was, though its precise mechanism was debated for decades, released energy estimated at between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT. Some estimates place it considerably higher. To put that in context, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 released approximately 15 kilotons. The Tunguska event was roughly 1,000 times more powerful. It flattened an estimated 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest. 80 million trees thrown outward from a central point like matchsticks caught in a wave, their trunks pointing away from the epicenter in a radial pattern that, seen from above, resembles a vast, silent explosion frozen in wood and earth. The shockwave was registered on barometric instruments as far away as England. The ground tremor was detected by seismic stations across Eurasia. In the weeks following the event, people across Europe and Western Russia reported unusually bright nights. Skies luminous enough to read by, even at midnight, attributed to ice particles suspended in the upper atmosphere by the explosion. And yet, for nearly 2 decades, no scientific expedition reached the site. The combination of the region's remoteness, the chaos of subsequent Russian history, revolution, civil war, the grinding early years of the Soviet state, and a general uncertainty about what had even happened meant that the taiga kept its secret largely undisturbed until 1927, when the Soviet mineralogist Leonid Kulik finally led the first dedicated expedition to the Tunguska region. What Kulik found when he reached the epicenter stunned him. The scale of destruction was beyond anything he had prepared for. Trees flattened in every direction across an area larger than a major city. The landscape transformed into a vast field of fallen timber now partially reclaimed by new growth. But at the very center, where a crater should have been, where any conventional meteorite impact should have left a clear, unmistakable depression, there was nothing. The trees at the epicenter were still standing, stripped of their branches but upright, like a row of telegraph poles marking a point of impossible intensity. No crater, no meteorite fragments of any significant size, nothing embedded in the earth to explain the most powerful explosion in modern human experience. The absence of a crater became the defining puzzle of the Tunguska event. It suggested that whatever had caused the explosion had not struck the ground at all, that it had detonated in the atmosphere several kilometers above the surface, in what scientists now call an airburst. The energy of the explosion had radiated outward and downward, flattening the forest below without leaving the conventional signature of an impact. The mainstream scientific explanation, developed and refined over the course of the 20th century and now broadly accepted, is that a small asteroid or comet fragment, estimated at between 50 and 80 meters in diameter, entered the atmosphere at high velocity and disintegrated explosively before reaching the ground, unable to survive the thermal and pressure stresses of atmospheric entry. The airburst released its energy across a wide area, explaining both the extraordinary scale of the destruction and the absence of a conventional crater. This explanation is scientifically coherent and consistent with what we now understand about the behavior of small planetary bodies entering dense atmosphere at high speed. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor event in Russia, which injured over 1,000 people and was captured on dozens of dashcam videos, demonstrated exactly this kind of airburst mechanism on a smaller scale, and gave scientists a modern reference point for understanding Tunguska. But the absence of substantial physical remains, the minimal meteoritic material recovered from the site despite decades of searching, has kept alternative explanations alive in the margins of scientific discussion. Some researchers have proposed a cometary origin, arguing that a fragment of ice and dust would leave less recoverable material than a rocky asteroid, though this too has been debated. Others have pointed to the unusual distribution of microscopic spherules and elevated iridium concentrations in peat layers, corresponding to 1908, as evidence requiring further interpretation. And then there are the theories that move beyond conventional planetary science entirely. A small number of researchers over the decades have proposed, with varying degrees of seriousness, that the Tunguska event was caused by a fragment of antimatter, which would annihilate on contact with normal matter and leave no recoverable debris. Others have suggested a miniature black hole passing through the Earth, entering over Siberia and exiting through the North Atlantic. These proposals are not supported by mainstream physics and are generally regarded as creative rather than scientific. More persistently and more intriguingly to some investigators is the question of the unusual phenomena reported in the region in the weeks before the explosion. Eyewitness accounts from Evenki communities describe strange lights in the sky, unusual sounds, and a general atmosphere of wrongness in the landscape. Observations that are difficult to evaluate across the distance of more than a century, filtered through translation and the inevitable distortions of oral transmission, but which researchers have periodically revisited as potentially meaningful data. The Evenki, whose ancestral territory encompasses the Tunguska region, had their own understanding of what had happened, one rooted in the framework of their relationship with the land and the spiritual forces they understood to inhabit it. The god Agdi, in Evenki tradition, had descended and scorched the earth. Their account was not scientific, but it captured something real, the sense of an event so far beyond ordinary experience that ordinary language was insufficient to contain it. 2,000 square kilometers of forest, 80 million fallen trees, an explosion 1,000 times the power of the first atomic bomb, and at the center of it, nothing. No crater, no fragment large enough to hold in your hand, no physical object commensurate with the scale of what it caused. Something hit the earth above Siberia on the morning of June 30th, 1908, with a force that reshaped the landscape for hundreds of miles in every direction. We are fairly confident we know what it was, but fairly confident is not the same as certain. And somewhere in the Siberian taiga, beneath the forest that has grown back over a century of silence, is it possible that a piece of the answer still waits, unrecovered, unexamined, patient as the earth itself? Something fell from the sky above Siberia and left a wound in the earth that still resists complete explanation. The force was astronomical, sudden, total, and indifferent to the lives it touched. But not all forces of destruction arrive from above. Some move through populations slowly, invisibly, carried on breath and water and the ordinary movements of human beings who have no idea what they are carrying. Picture the Anatolian Plateau in the 14th century BC. This is the heartland of the Hittite Empire, a civilization we have briefly encountered before, powerful enough to negotiate with Egypt as an equal, sophisticated enough to produce written treaties, diplomatic correspondence, and legal codes that still survive in the clay tablets of their ancient capital. The city of Hattusa sits in the bend of a river in the high plateau of what is now north-central Turkey, its great stone walls enclosing temples, palaces, and administrative buildings spread across a landscape of extraordinary scale. The double-headed eagle, the massive stone gates carved with lions and sphinxes, the cuneiform archives that record in painstaking detail the concerns of a superpower managing an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the borders of Mesopotamia. It is a world of genuine complexity and genuine power. And into this world, sometime around 1322 BC, came something that the Hittites themselves could not explain, could not control, and could not stop: a plague. What makes the Hittite plague historically remarkable is not merely its devastating effect, though devastating it was, killing 2 kings in succession and destabilizing an empire for decades, but the fact that it left behind one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world: the plague prayers of Mursili II. Mursili II was a Hittite king who inherited a throne already weakened by years of epidemic. His father, Suppiluliuma III, one of the greatest military commanders of the Bronze Age, had died of the plague. His brother and successor, Arnawanda II, had died of it shortly after. Mursili himself survived, but he ruled over a kingdom hollowed out by years of death, agricultural disruption, and the loss of experienced administrators, soldiers, and craftspeople whose knowledge died with them. What Mursili left behind is not a military record or a diplomatic treaty. It is a prayer. Several prayers, in fact, preserved in clay tablets discovered at Hattusa, in which he addresses the gods of the Hittite pantheon with a directness and an emotional rawness that feels, across 3,000 years, startlingly human. He asks why the plague has come. He searches for the sin that must have caused it. Because in the Hittite understanding of divine mechanics, catastrophe did not arrive without cause. The gods punish transgression. If the plague was here, something had been done wrong. He examines the possibilities with the care of a man genuinely trying to understand. He considers whether the plague entered Hittite territory through Egyptian prisoners of war brought back after a military campaign, a detail that makes the prayers one of the earliest recorded attempts to trace the origin of a disease outbreak. He considers whether ritual obligations had been neglected, whether oaths had been broken, whether the gods had been offended by actions he himself had not committed but had inherited responsibility for. It is, in its own way, an epidemiological inquiry conducted in the language of theology. What was the plague? The tablets do not describe symptoms in clinical terms. Hittite medical writing was not structured around the kind of diagnostic detail that would allow easy modern identification. Researchers have proposed several candidates. Tularemia, a bacterial infection carried by animals and potentially transmitted through contaminated water or the handling of infected carcasses, has attracted scholarly attention, partly because the Hittite prayers specifically mention the possibility of the disease entering through animals brought back from military campaigns. The movement of Egyptian prisoners, animals, and supplies along military supply lines would have created exactly the kind of conditions in which a zoonotic disease, one that crosses from animals to humans, could establish itself in a new population with no prior immunity. Others have proposed plague in the more specific sense. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the later Black Death, though direct evidence for this remains elusive. Typhus, smallpox, and various hemorrhagic fevers have also been considered, each with varying degrees of supporting argument and varying degrees of archaeological and textual evidence. The honest answer is that we do not know. Ancient disease identification is one of the most challenging areas of historical research, dependent on finding biological material in sufficient condition for analysis or on textual descriptions detailed enough to support diagnosis. The Hittite tablets offer neither. What they do offer is a picture of the consequences. The plague ran through the Hittite Empire for at least 20 years, possibly longer. Military capacity declined as soldiers died, and recruitment became difficult in a population under sustained demographic pressure. Agricultural output fell as farmers died and fields went untended. The administrative apparatus, dependent on trained scribes and officials, degraded as the knowledge stored in human memory was lost generation by generation. The empire recovered, partially. Mursili II proved a capable king despite the circumstances of his inheritance, and the Hittites continued as a major power for another century. But the plague had changed something fundamental, weakened the foundations in ways that may not have been immediately visible, but that contributed to a structure less able to withstand the pressures that would eventually bring it down entirely. When the Sea Peoples arrived and the Bronze Age collapsed in the decades around 1200 BC, the Hittites, already weakened by a century of accumulated losses, disappeared more completely than almost any other Bronze Age civilization. As we noted at the beginning of this journey, their very existence was forgotten for over 3,000 years. Was the plague a significant factor in that ultimate vulnerability? Most historians would say yes, one thread among several in a web of interconnected pressures that together proved fatal to the empire. Others argue for its primacy, suggesting that 20 years of epidemic damage to the Hittite population and administrative structure left wounds that never fully healed. Mursili II prayed to his gods for an answer. He wanted to understand the mechanism of his world's suffering, to find the cause, assign the responsibility, and perhaps find the remedy. He never found a complete answer. Neither, in the most fundamental sense, have we. The clay tablets that preserved his prayers survived the destruction of Hattusa, survived the 3,000 years of silence that followed, and now sit in museum collections, the voice of a king speaking across the millennia to anyone willing to listen. He was asking the same questions we ask when catastrophe arrives without warning. Why did it come? Where did it begin? And is it possible that somewhere in the unexcavated layers beneath the Hittite heartland, the biological evidence that could finally answer those questions still waits? Preserved in the cold, dry clay of a civilization that the earth swallowed whole? Mursili II asked his gods why catastrophe had come to his people, and the gods, as they so often do, offered no clear reply. The plague moved through his empire and left its damage regardless of prayer, regardless of piety, regardless of the careful theological reasoning of a king desperate to understand. Disease does not negotiate, and neither, as it turns out, does drought. Picture the Nile Valley in the 22nd century BC. For nearly 500 years, the old kingdom of ancient Egypt has represented something without precedent in human history. A centralized state of extraordinary stability, organized around the absolute divine authority of the pharaoh, capable of mobilizing human labor on a scale that produced the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Sphinx, and a complex of monuments so enduring that they still define our image of ancient civilization 4,500 years later. The Nile was the engine of all of it. Every year, with a reliability that the Egyptians came to regard as cosmic law, the river flooded its banks, receded, and left behind a layer of rich, dark silt across the floodplain. On that silt, in the weeks following the inundation, Egyptian farmers planted crops that fed millions. The rhythm was so consistent, so fundamental to Egyptian life and Egyptian identity, that the flood itself was understood not as a natural event, but as a divine act. The god Happy rising from the river's depths to sustain the land and its people. For centuries, Happy rose on schedule, and then, sometime around 2200 BC, he did not. The Old Kingdom collapse is one of the most dramatic reversals in ancient history. A state that had functioned with remarkable coherence for 5 centuries disintegrated within a few generations. The central government fragmented. The absolute authority of the pharaoh dissolved into a patchwork of regional powers, local governors, the nomarchs, who had previously administered their provinces in the name of the king, but who now effectively ruled independently. The elaborate bureaucratic machinery that had organized pyramid construction, agricultural distribution, and state administration broke down. The 6th dynasty, the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom, ended not with conquest or revolution, but with a kind of institutional exhaustion, a slow draining away of central authority that no single event explains. What happened? Archaeology and paleoclimatology have, over recent decades, built a compelling case for climate as the primary driver. The event known as the 4.2 kilo-year event, a prolonged period of severe aridification that affected a vast swath of the globe from West Africa to East Asia approximately 4,200 years ago, appears in the geological record with remarkable consistency. Lake sediment cores from across the region show a sharp decline in precipitation. Pollen records indicate the retreat of vegetation. Wind-blown dust deposits in the Nile Delta increased dramatically during this period, suggesting the expansion of desert conditions northward into previously productive agricultural zones. In Egypt specifically, the evidence points to a catastrophic reduction in the Nile flood, not for 1 year or 2, but for decades. Low flood years mean thin silt deposits. Thin silt deposits mean poor harvests. Poor harvests mean famine. And famine, in a society built on the assumption of divine guaranteed agricultural abundance, means something far more destructive than hunger. It means the collapse of the theological framework that holds the entire political structure together. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler in the Egyptian understanding. He was the intermediary between the human world and the divine order. The guarantor of Ma'at, the concept of cosmic balance and rightness that encompassed justice, truth, and the proper functioning of the natural world. When the Nile flooded on schedule, Ma'at was being maintained. When it did not, when crops failed, when people starved, when the desert crept toward the river, the implication was theological as much as agricultural. The pharaoh had failed. The divine order had been disrupted. and a government whose legitimacy rested entirely on its ability to maintain that order had lost, in the most visible and devastating way possible, its claim to authority. Ancient texts from this period, the documents historians call the First Intermediate Period literature, preserve something of the psychological shock of the collapse. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, a literary text of disputed date but generally associated with this period of upheaval, describes a world turned upside down with an urgency that carries genuine distress across the millennia. The poor have become wealthy. The wealthy have been stripped of everything. The dead are thrown into the river. Laughter has perished. Grief walks the land. Whether Ipuwer's account describes specific events or represents a more general literary meditation on chaos and social inversion remains debated. But its emotional register, the sense of a world whose fundamental rules have been violated, captures something real about what the collapse of the Old Kingdom represented to those who experienced it. The political fragmentation that followed was not merely administrative inconvenience. It meant that the centralized food distribution systems that had buffered regional communities against local shortfalls no longer functioned. It meant that the infrastructure projects that maintained irrigation systems and agricultural land went uncoordinated and eventually unperformed. It meant that the accumulated institutional knowledge of the Egyptian state, stored in its bureaucracy, its trained officials, its established procedures, began to disperse and degrade. Some researchers have pointed to additional factors beyond climate. The extraordinary centralization of the Old Kingdom may have carried within it the seeds of its own fragility. A system so dependent on the functioning of a single apex authority that any significant disruption at the top propagated catastrophically downward. The increasingly elaborate administrative machinery of the later Old Kingdom, some argue, had become an end in itself, consuming resources in its own maintenance rather than directing them effectively toward the agricultural and infrastructural needs that justified its existence. There is also evidence of significant population movement during this period, displaced communities from the drying regions of the Sahara and the Levant moving into the Nile Delta, and the margins of the floodplain, adding demographic pressure to an already stressed system. And then there is a quieter possibility, one that the texts hint at without fully articulating. The nomarchs, the regional governors who accumulated power as the central state weakened, did not simply fill a vacuum. Some of them appear to have actively expanded their authority during the crisis years, taking advantage of the pharaoh's inability to project power effectively into the provinces. Whether this represents opportunism, genuine local crisis management, or something closer to deliberate political maneuvering remains unclear. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom still stand on the Giza Plateau. Immovable, apparently eternal, the most visible monument to the confidence and capability of a civilization at its height. They outlasted the state that built them by centuries. They outlasted the climate crisis that brought that state down. They outlasted empires and religions and languages that rose and fell in their shadow. The pharaohs who built them understood themselves as permanent. They built for eternity, in stone, against the possibility that anything could threaten what they had constructed. The Nile had other ideas, and when the flood failed to come year after year in the darkness of a decades-long drought, what did the last officials of the Old Kingdom say to each other in the emptying halls of a palace whose god-king could no longer keep his most fundamental promise? Did they understand what was happening to them? Or did the end arrive, as it so often does, before anyone quite recognized it for what it was? The Old Kingdom of Egypt fell when the river that sustained it stopped behaving as it always had. A civilization built on divine promise confronted the silence of unresponsive gods, and in that silence, everything unraveled. But not every abandonment is driven by catastrophe. Not every city is emptied by famine or plague, or the slow withdrawal of a river's generosity. Some places are simply left, deliberately, quietly, and for reasons that 4 centuries of inquiry have not fully resolved. Picture the eastern slopes of the Andes in the 15th century AD. At an elevation of approximately 2,400 meters above sea level, on a narrow ridge between 2 mountain peaks, sits one of the most astonishing feats of human construction ever undertaken. The site commands views that still stop visitors in their tracks. The Urubamba River coiling far below through its deep green canyon, cloud formations moving through the mountain valleys at eye level, the surrounding peaks rising into a sky that feels close enough to touch. Machu Picchu was built here, in this improbable location, sometime around 1450 AD, almost certainly under the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, one of the most remarkable rulers of the pre-Columbian Americas, a man who transformed a regional kingdom into the largest empire the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. The construction is extraordinary by any standard. Massive granite blocks, quarried from the surrounding mountains, fitted together without mortar with a precision that has allowed the structures to survive centuries of Andean earthquakes virtually intact. Terraced agricultural platforms cascading down the mountainside, each level designed to capture soil and moisture and sunlight with sophisticated agricultural intent. Temples aligned to the movements of the sun and stars, their windows and doorways positioned to mark the solstices with beams of light falling on sacred stones. This was not a frontier outpost or a utilitarian administrative center. Everything about Machu Picchu speaks of intention, of significance, of a place that mattered deeply to the people who built it. And sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century, they left it. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Andes in 1532 and systematically dismantled the Inca Empire over the following decades, capturing and executing the Emperor Atahualpa, seizing the gold and silver that had accumulated over generations, destroying the administrative and religious infrastructure of an entire civilization. They appear to have had no knowledge of Machu Picchu's existence. The site does not appear in the Spanish colonial records. No conquistador claimed to have found it, plundered it, or converted its temples to Christian purposes. In the vast documentation of Spanish colonial activity in the Andes, Machu Picchu is simply absent, which means it was already abandoned before the Spanish arrived, or effectively hidden from them, or both. Hiram Bingham, the American explorer and academic who brought Machu Picchu to international attention in 1911, though local Peruvian farmers had never entirely lost awareness of its existence, initially believed he had found Vilcabamba, the legendary last refuge of the Inca resistance against Spanish conquest. That identification was subsequently disproved, and Vilcabamba was located elsewhere. But Bingham's error illuminates something important about the site: the degree to which Machu Picchu had retreated from documented history so completely that its very identity required reconstruction. The mainstream scholarly understanding of why Machu Picchu was abandoned has evolved considerably over the past several decades. The site is now generally understood to have functioned primarily as a royal estate, a retreat for Pachacuti and his royal lineage, a place of ceremony and seasonal residence rather than a permanent administrative capital. In the Inca system of royal succession, each new emperor was expected to build his own estate rather than inherit his predecessors, a practice that generated extraordinary construction projects but also created a structural peculiarity. The estates of dead rulers were maintained by the descendants and retainers of those rulers, sustained by the agricultural and economic resources assigned to them. When Pachacuti died, Machu Picchu passed into the care of his royal lineage. When the Spanish conquest destroyed the social and economic structures of the Inca Empire, the system that had sustained those royal estates collapsed with it. The people who had maintained Machu Picchu, the agricultural workers, the priests, the administrators of the royal household, lost the institutional framework that had given their presence there meaning and support. They left. Not in panic, not under direct threat, but because the structure that had organized their lives around this particular mountain ridge had ceased to exist. It is a plausible and well-supported explanation. It fits the known facts of Inca succession practice, the timing of the site's apparent abandonment, and the broader context of what the Spanish conquest did to Inca social organization. And yet questions persist. The population that occupied Machu Picchu at its height has been variously estimated, and the site's capacity for permanent habitation versus periodic ceremonial or seasonal use remains debated. Skeletal remains recovered from burial sites at the site by Bingham's expeditions and subsequently analyzed have generated ongoing discussion about the demographics of who actually lived there. The ratio of men to women, the apparent prevalence of individuals from diverse geographic origins, suggesting a population drawn from across the Inca Empire rather than a single local community. What exactly was happening at Machu Picchu? Was it purely a royal retreat? A religious center? An astronomical observatory? A testing ground for agricultural techniques at altitude? The architecture supports elements of all these interpretations, and researchers have argued for each. The Intihuatana stone, a precisely carved granite ritual object whose name translates approximately as the hitching post of the sun, speaks to astronomical and ceremonial functions of considerable sophistication. The agricultural terraces speak to serious food production. The residential quarters speak to permanent habitation. The site resists reduction to a single purpose. And there is the question that the jungle itself poses. The cloud forest that began reclaiming Machu Picchu within decades of its abandonment. The vegetation that had grown so completely over the site by 1911 that Bingham needed a local farmer to guide him to it, is a reminder of how quickly the natural world reasserts itself over human construction when the human intention behind it withdraws. The stones resisted. The mortar-free joints held against centuries of earthquakes and weather. The terraces survived, their drainage system still functioning, still carrying water away from the foundations with the quiet efficiency their builders intended. The mountain held Machu Picchu in place, preserved it, waited. For whom? For what purpose did this extraordinary place exist at the edge of a mountain in the Andes, visible from almost nowhere, known to almost no one outside the Inca world, built with a precision and a beauty that far exceeded the requirements of any purely practical function? And what did the last people to leave it feel as they descended the mountain path and the cloud forest closed behind them? Did they believe they would return? Or did they already know in the collapsing world of the 16th century Andes that no one was coming back? The last people to leave Machu Picchu descended a mountain path and disappeared into a world that was already ending around them. They left behind stones fitted so precisely that the mountain itself could not shake them loose, terraces still draining water with the quiet efficiency of forgotten intention. There is something in that image, a place outlasting its purpose, its builders, its entire context, that echoes across civilizations and centuries. Because Machu Picchu is not the only great construction that outlasted the world that made it. Picture the highlands of northern Ethiopia in the first centuries of the Common Era. The air here is cool and thin at altitude, the landscape rolling and dramatic, escarpments dropping away into valleys of extraordinary depth, the sky enormous and luminous above the plateau. This is the Tigray region, and rising from its ancient soil, in and around the city that would give the civilization its name, stand monuments of a scale and ambition that even today command a particular kind of silence from those who encounter them for the first time. The stelae of Aksum. Massive granite obelisks, some rising over 20 meters into the Ethiopian sky, carved to represent multi-story buildings in precise architectural detail. False doors, windows, and beam ends rendered in stone with an exactness that speaks of a culture at the absolute height of its confidence and capability. The largest ever erected, now fallen and broken, its fragments still lying where they landed, would have stood over 30 meters tall and weighed an estimated 500 tons. No civilization in the ancient world, outside of Egypt, moved and erected stone on this scale. Aksum was not a peripheral civilization. At its height, between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries AD, it was one of the four great powers of the ancient world, ranked alongside Rome, Persia, and China, in a contemporary account that reflects how the world of late antiquity perceived the balance of global power. It controlled trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, channeling the flow of ivory, gold, incense, and slaves between Africa, Arabia, and the wider world. Its coins circulated across a vast commercial network. Its kings corresponded with Roman emperors. Its conversion to Christianity in the 4th century AD making it one of the earliest Christian states in history, connected it to the emerging theological and political architecture of late antique Christianity. This was a civilization of genuine sophistication and genuine reach. And by the 8th or 9th century AD, it had contracted so dramatically, so completely, that it had effectively withdrawn from the world stage it had occupied for centuries. What happened to Aksum is a question that scholarship has been slowly, carefully reassembling for decades, complicated by the relative scarcity of written sources from within the civilization itself, by the challenges of archaeological access in the region, and by the degree to which later Ethiopian historical tradition has overlaid the Aksumite period with layers of religious and dynastic mythology that are difficult to separate from historical fact. The mainstream explanation draws on several converging factors, each significant individually, collectively devastating. Climate change again makes its appearance in this story. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests a period of increasing aridification across the Horn of Africa beginning in the late 1st millennium AD, reducing agricultural productivity in a highland kingdom whose population had grown substantially during the centuries of prosperity. Trees were cut for construction, for fuel, and for agricultural clearance on a scale that, over generations, degraded the watershed and accelerated soil erosion across the plateau. The land that had sustained Aksumite prosperity began, slowly and then more rapidly, to give diminishing returns. Trade disruption compounded the environmental pressure. The rise of Islam in the 7th century AD fundamentally reorganized the commercial geography of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The trading networks that had sustained Aksumite prosperity were redirected, consolidated under new powers with different political allegiances and different commercial interests. Aksum, whose wealth had been built on its position as a broker between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean trade, found that position eroded and eventually eliminated as the political landscape of the surrounding world transformed beyond recognition. The port of Adulis, Aksum's great window to the sea, the commercial gateway through which its trade goods had flowed for centuries, declined and eventually ceased to function as a significant trading center. Without Adulis, the revenue streams that had funded monumental construction, military capacity, and the administrative apparatus of empire dried up. A kingdom that had minted coins stopped minting them. A civilization that had erected 30-meter granite obelisks stopped building at monumental scale. And then there is the figure of Gudit, or Yodit, as she appears in some accounts. A queen or warlord whose memory in Ethiopian tradition is associated with fire, destruction, and the violent overthrow of the Aksumite Christian kingdom, probably sometime in the 10th century AD. The accounts of Gudit are a complex mixture of historical memory, legend, and later political mythology. Some traditions describe her as a Jewish queen leading a coalition of non-Christian peoples against an Aksumite state weakened by centuries of decline. Others portray her as a local ruler capitalizing on internal fragmentation. Her ethnic and religious identity has been disputed by scholars, and the degree to which her campaigns represented a single coherent event or a composite memory of multiple periods of instability is not fully clear. What the Gudit traditions do suggest, however, is that the final contraction of Aksumite power was not merely a quiet administrative withdrawal, but involved periods of real violence. Churches burned, royal lineages disrupted, the physical infrastructure of the Christian kingdom attacked with deliberate destructive intent. Archaeological evidence of destruction and abandonment at several Aksumite sites is consistent with a period of significant conflict, though the precise dating and attribution of that evidence remains debated. There is also the question of what Aksum took with it as it retreated southward and into the highlands, what it preserved, transformed, and transmitted to the successor states and cultural traditions that emerged from its contraction. Ethiopian Christianity, one of the oldest and most distinctive Christian traditions in the world, carries within it the direct institutional inheritance of the Aksumite Church. The Ge'ez language, in which the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy is still conducted, is the direct descendant of the Aksumite written language. The imperial traditions of the Ethiopian state, which persisted in various forms into the 20th century, drew their legitimacy from claimed continuity with Aksumite royal lineage. Aksum did not simply disappear. It transformed. It contracted, consolidated, and continued, altered almost beyond recognition from the commercial superpower that had ranked with Rome, but alive in the institutions and traditions and landscapes of a civilization that drew its deepest roots from the highland plateau. And yet the city of Aksum itself, the physical place, the urban center that had once been the capital of a world power, shrank to a fraction of its former size, its monumental stelae standing over a settlement whose inhabitants had long since ceased to have any connection to the people who erected them. The great obelisks became, in time, objects of mystery even to those who lived in their shadow. Ancient, enormous, and only partially remembered. One of the Aksumite stelae was removed to Rome by Mussolini's forces in 1937, following the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and stood in the Piazza di Porta Capena for decades, a piece of one civilization's monumental confidence repurposed as a trophy of another's imperial ambition. It was returned to Ethiopia in 2008, 70 years after its removal, and re-erected in Aksum in 2008. Stone that had traveled from an ancient highland plateau to a European capital and back again, carrying in its carved surfaces the memory of a world that both the Italians who took it and the Ethiopians who reclaimed it understood only imperfectly. The stelae that remain standing at Aksum are among the most remarkable objects in the world, not merely for their scale or their craft, but for what they represent about the distance between a civilization's moment of maximum confidence and the long aftermath that follows. They were built to endure. They were built to declare, in the most unambiguous physical language available, that the civilization that produced them was permanent. The civilization contracted. The trade routes shifted. The rains came differently. The political world reorganized itself around new powers and new faiths that had no place for Aksum as it had been. And the stones remained, somewhere beneath the soil of the Tigray Plateau, beneath the layers of centuries of settlement and resettlement, and the accumulation of all the ordinary human activity that has continued on this landscape since Aksum's florescence, lie the unexcavated remains of one of the ancient world's great powers. Palaces not yet found, archives not yet read, the physical record of decisions and events and people that the written sources have not preserved. A civilization that ranked with Rome, that corresponded with emperors, that moved 500-ton stones into the sky. How much of its story remains underground? And what would those buried records tell us, if we could read them, about the long and complicated process by which one of the ancient world's great powers looked at the world changing around it, and quietly, over generations, let go? Aksum let go slowly, trade by trade, reign by reign, generation by generation, until the city that had ranked with Rome became a shadow of its former self, its great stones standing over a landscape that had largely forgotten what built them. But not every great city fades. Some are left in a single motion, not gradually drained of life, but deliberately, almost surgically, emptied. And few cities in the ancient world present that puzzle more starkly than Teotihuacan. Picture the basin of Mexico in the 1st century AD, at an elevation of over 2,000 meters, in a broad highland valley ringed by volcanic mountains. A city is beginning to take shape on a scale that the ancient Americas had never seen. It will grow over the following centuries into the largest city in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere, home to perhaps 100,000 people at its height, possibly more. Its central avenue, the Street of the Dead, runs for more than 4 kilometers in a near-perfect alignment, oriented slightly east of north, flanked by ceremonial platforms, temples, and administrative compounds that speak of urban planning executed with extraordinary precision and ambition. At the northern end of the Street of the Dead stands the Pyramid of the Moon. Further south, slightly offset from the central axis, rises the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest structures in the ancient world, its base comparable in area to the Great Pyramid of Giza, its mass comprising over 1 million cubic meters of fill. And at the southern end of the avenue, the Ciudadela, a vast enclosed plaza containing the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, whose facade is adorned with carved serpent heads of remarkable intricacy and power. This city was not a regional center. It was a metropolis, a place that drew people from across Mesoamerica, a commercial and religious hub whose influence extended from the Gulf Coast to the highlands of Guatemala, from the valley of Oaxaca to the distant Maya lowlands. Teotihuacan obsidian, distributed through trade networks that reached every corner of Mesoamerica, has been found in archaeological sites hundreds of miles from the city. Its artistic styles appear in murals, ceramics, and architectural forms across the region. It was, in the most meaningful sense, the center of a world. And then, sometime around 550 AD, something happened. The city was not conquered and abandoned by an outside force, at least not in the conventional sense. What the archaeological record shows is something more selective, more deliberate, and in some ways more disturbing. The civic and ceremonial core of Teotihuacan, the temples, the palaces, the administrative compounds along the Street of the Dead, was systematically burned and destroyed. Not all of it, and not randomly. The destruction is concentrated in the structures associated with the elite, the ruling class, the priestly hierarchy, whoever controlled the religious and political life of the city. Residential compounds in the outer areas of the city show less evidence of burning, suggesting that ordinary inhabitants may have remained for some time after the destruction of the center. Who burned the ceremonial heart of Teotihuacan, and why? The mainstream interpretation favored by most contemporary archaeologists points to internal revolt. The evidence pattern: elite compounds targeted, residential zones less affected, no clear sign of an external military assault large enough to account for citywide disruption, is consistent with an uprising from within. A population of 100,000 people, governed for centuries by an elite whose authority rested on religious and ideological claims, may have reached a breaking point. Resource stress, drought, growing inequality between the elaborate compounds of the ruling class and the more modest conditions of ordinary residents. All of these could have generated the conditions for a violent internal reckoning. It would not be without precedent. The history of large urban centers is, in part, a history of the tensions generated by concentrated inequality and the periodic explosions those tensions produce. If Teotihuacan's elite had demanded too much, in labor, in tribute, in the accumulated obligations of a religious system that required constant feeding, then the burning of their compounds and temples may represent not catastrophe from outside, but judgment from within. But the internal revolt hypothesis, compelling as it is, leaves questions unanswered. Even if the elite were overthrown or driven out, why did the city itself empty? Population estimates for Teotihuacan after the burning dropped dramatically. The city did not recover, did not repopulate under new leadership, did not transition smoothly to a different political arrangement. It shrank and continued to shrink until it was a fraction of its former self. Climate enters the picture here, as it does in so many of these stories. Paleoclimatic research has identified a prolonged drought affecting central Mexico in the 6th century AD, a period of significantly reduced rainfall that would have placed serious stress on a large urban population dependent on intensive agriculture in a highland basin with limited water resources. The combination of environmental pressure and political instability may have created conditions in which the city simply became unsustainable. Too large, too resource-hungry, too dependent on an agricultural system that drought had rendered unreliable. People left. In the way that people always leave places that can no longer sustain them, family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood, over years and decades, until the great avenues were emptier than they had ever been, and the pyramids stood over a city that had lost the human density that gave them meaning. And yet the mystery does not close even here, because Teotihuacan was not merely abandoned. It was, in some sense, preserved. The Aztecs, who arose in the same basin centuries later and built their own empire of extraordinary scale and ambition, encountered the ruins of Teotihuacan, and were so overwhelmed by what they found that they incorporated it directly into their cosmological understanding of the world. They named it Teotihuacan, a Nahuatl name meaning the place where the gods were created, or the place where men become gods. They believed it was the site where the gods had gathered in darkness at the beginning of the current world age to sacrifice themselves, creating the sun and the moon through their self-immolation. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon received their current names from the Aztecs, names that the actual builders of those structures, whoever they were, would not have recognized. The Aztecs made pilgrimages to Teotihuacan. Their rulers were buried with objects collected from its ruins. They venerated it as a sacred site, even as they could not identify who had built it or why it had been abandoned. For them, its very emptiness was part of its power. A city so ancient, so vast, so clearly the product of superhuman ambition, that only divine agency could account for its existence. We are in a different position. We have archaeology, radiocarbon dating, chemical analysis, LiDAR surveys that have revealed the full extent of the city's layout beneath centuries of soil accumulation. We know approximately when Teotihuacan was built, when it peaked, when it declined. We have physical evidence of the burning. We have demographic data from the settlement patterns of the surrounding region. And we still cannot say with certainty who built it. The people of Teotihuacan left no deciphered writing system. They left no king lists, no dynastic records, no texts that tell us what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what they believed about their own origins and purpose. The murals that cover the walls of their compounds, extraordinary, vivid, cosmologically complex images of gods, rituals, and natural forces, speak a visual language that scholars have been working to interpret for decades without achieving consensus on its fundamental meanings. A city of 100,000 people, the largest in the Western Hemisphere, and we do not know what its inhabitants called themselves. Recent tunnel excavations beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, a passage discovered in 2003 and explored over subsequent years by archaeologist Sergio Gomez Chavez and his team, have revealed a ritual space of remarkable complexity, sealed for nearly 2,000 years. Liquid mercury pools, thousands of ritual offerings, pyrite mirrors, miniature landscapes, and at the end of the tunnel, 3 chambers that may represent the underworld geography of Teotihuacan's cosmology. The tunnel was deliberately sealed, its entrance blocked with tons of fill, sometime around 250 AD, in the middle of the city's period of maximum power and prosperity. Why? What required sealing so completely, so permanently, that it remained hidden until the 21st century? The excavations are ongoing. The chambers have not yet been fully explored. Whatever the tunnel was built to contain, whatever ritual, whatever knowledge, whatever remains, it has waited in the dark beneath the Feathered Serpent Temple for nearly 2,000 years. The city above it rose, burned, emptied, was venerated by a civilization that could not read its history, was excavated by archaeologists who can read its stones, but not its words. And still, in the sealed chambers beneath the street where the gods were said to have created the world, something waits. What is down there? And when the excavators finally open those last sealed spaces, what will the city that refused to give up its name finally tell us about who it was? The sealed chambers beneath Teotihuacan's temple still wait in the dark, holding whatever the city's builders placed there 2,000 years ago and chose, for reasons we cannot fully reconstruct, to lock away from the world above. Some things are hidden deliberately. Others are hidden by time, by distance, by the simple fact that the world that knew about them eventually ceased to exist, and took its knowledge with it. And few historical episodes illustrate that particular kind of disappearance more quietly or more completely than what happened on the northeastern edge of North America roughly 1,000 years ago. Picture the northern tip of Newfoundland in the 11th century AD. It is a landscape of extraordinary, uncompromising character. A rocky headland where the Gulf of St. Lawrence meets the Labrador Sea, the land low and wind-scoured, the vegetation thin and tough, the ocean a constant presence in every direction. Icebergs move through the summer waters offshore with a slow, indifferent grandeur. The light in the long northern evenings carries a particular quality, clear and horizontal, falling across the landscape without warmth, making everything visible and somehow remote at the same time. It was here, at a place the Norse called Vinland, that European human beings set foot on the North American continent approximately 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus made the voyage that history remembers. The Norse sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts, describe in considerable detail the voyages that led to the discovery and attempted settlement of Vinland. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red who had settled Greenland, is credited with the first deliberate voyage to the new land, sailing west from Greenland and finding a country of timber, wild grapes, and rivers rich with salmon. Subsequent expeditions followed, including a more ambitious colonization attempt led by a merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni, who arrived with several ships, livestock, and enough people to establish a permanent settlement, accompanied by his pregnant wife Gudrid, who would give birth to a son named Snorri, the first European child known to have been born in the Americas. The settlement lasted perhaps 3 years. Then the Norse left. For centuries, the sagas were treated as mythology, entertaining narratives of the Norse world, perhaps containing kernels of historical truth, but not reliable as accounts of actual events. The idea that Norse voyagers had reached North America before Columbus was widely dismissed as romantic fantasy. And then, in 1960, a Norwegian archaeologist named Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Steen. Ingstad began excavating a series of grass-covered mounds at a place called Lonso Meadows at the northern tip of Newfoundland. What they found beneath the turf was unmistakably Norse. The remains of 8 timber-frame turf buildings, a bronze ring-headed pin of a distinctly Norse type, a spindle whorl indicating the presence of women, a stone lamp of Norse design, iron boat rivets, and most significantly, evidence of iron smelting using a technique and a type of bog iron ore entirely consistent with Norse practice and entirely inconsistent with any indigenous North American tradition. The sagas were real. The Norse had been here. Lonso Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its archaeological significance beyond dispute. It represents the earliest known European presence in the Americas, a fact that has been absorbed into the historical record with surprisingly little disruption to the broader narrative of discovery and settlement that Columbus initiated 5 centuries later. But Lonso Meadows, extraordinary as it is, answers only the first and most basic question. Yes, the Norse were here. The harder questions, how long they stayed, how far they ranged, why they left, and whether Lonso Meadows represents the full extent of their American presence, remain open in ways that continue to drive research and debate. The sagas themselves describe not one but several different locations in the new lands. Helluland, a rocky, glaciated coast generally identified with Baffin Island. Markland, a forested coast generally identified with Labrador. And Vinland itself, whose location has been debated for decades. Lonso Meadows is widely accepted as a Norse site in or near Vinland, but whether it is the Vinland of the sagas, the place of wild grapes and abundance described in such evocative terms, is less certain. The climate of northern Newfoundland in the 11th century was not hospitable to the wild grapes the sagas describe. Grapes grow further south, which raises the possibility that the Norse ranged considerably further down the North American coast than the single confirmed site suggests. Recent research has provided tantalizing hints in that direction. A potential Norse site at Point Rosie in southwestern Newfoundland generated significant excitement when it was identified through satellite imagery analysis in 2016, though subsequent excavation produced ambiguous results that neither confirmed nor ruled out Norse presence. Elsewhere, researchers have used LiDAR technology and satellite imagery to scan the northeastern American coastline for anomalies consistent with Norse construction techniques. Nothing definitive has yet emerged. But the physical evidence that has accumulated from indigenous sites across the Canadian Arctic tells a different story. one of sustained contact between Norse Greenland and the peoples of North America that extended well beyond the brief Vinland settlement. Norse copper, bronze, and iron objects have been found at Dorset and Thule culture sites across the eastern Arctic, distributed through trading networks that reached hundreds of miles inland. Accounts of the Kavlunite, the Norse, in Inuit oral tradition, suggest a relationship that lasted for generations. This was not a single brief encounter, but a recurring, if perhaps not always peaceful, pattern of interaction. Why did the Vinland settlement fail? The sagas are relatively candid about this. The Norse accounts describe escalating conflict with the indigenous peoples they called the Skraelings, a term whose exact connotations are debated, but which was applied to both the Dorset people and, later, the Inuit. The Skraelings were initially approached as trading partners, but relations deteriorated into violence. The Norse were outnumbered, unable to project military force in an unfamiliar landscape against people who knew it intimately, and too far from any support base in Greenland to sustain a contested settlement. They left because they could not stay. The continent was occupied, and the people who occupied it were not going to yield it to a small Norse expedition, however determined. It is, in retrospect, a more honest outcome than the one Columbus's voyages would eventually produce. Though honesty was not what determined the historical difference. What determined it was numbers, disease, and the organizational capacity of the states that eventually followed European contact. The Norse had none of those advantages in 1000 AD. They had a handful of ships, a few hundred people, and the same iron and determination they had brought to Iceland and Greenland. It was not enough. But the question of what the Norse left behind, in the landscape, in the genetic record of indigenous populations, in the cultural memory of peoples who encountered them, remains genuinely open. Genetic studies of indigenous North American populations have occasionally suggested European admixture predating Columbus, though the interpretation of such studies is contested and methodologically complex. Stories preserved in the traditions of various indigenous communities along the northeastern seaboard have been examined for possible Norse content, with mixed results. The archaeology of the contact period remains incompletely explored. And then there is the deeper question about what might have been. The Norse reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They had the navigational technology, the seafaring tradition, and the demonstrated capacity to establish functioning communities in inhospitable environments, as Greenland showed. If circumstances had been different, if the Vinland climate had been more hospitable, if the indigenous population had been smaller or more receptive, if the Greenland colony had been larger and more capable of sustained support, would European contact with the Americas have unfolded centuries earlier and in a fundamentally different way? That question has no answer. History went the way it went, not the way it might have gone. What remains is a grass-covered headland in Newfoundland, where the outlines of Norse buildings can still be traced in the earth, and a set of sagas written down in Iceland centuries after the events they describe, preserving in their careful, understated prose the memory of people who sailed to the edge of the known world and found something beyond it. They called it Vinland. They stayed for 3 years, or perhaps a little more. They fought and traded and had children, and eventually turned their ships around and went back to Greenland. They left no lasting settlement. They left no colony. They left, as far as we can tell, almost no trace on the history of the continent they had found. But did they leave something we haven't found yet? Somewhere along the northeastern coastline of North America, in the soil beneath a forest, in the sediment of a river estuary, in the walls of a structure long since collapsed and overgrown. Is it possible that the Norse presence in the Americas was wider, deeper, and more sustained than the single site we have confirmed? And if it was, what happened to the people who stayed? The Norse sailed away from Vinland and left almost nothing behind. A few outlines in the earth, a handful of objects, the memory of a contact that history nearly forgot entirely. They had found something extraordinary and could not hold it. But the story of civilizations that found something extraordinary and then lost it does not belong only to the north, only to the cold, only to the edge of the known world. Sometimes it belongs to the warm blue water of the Mediterranean, to an island so fertile, so strategically placed, so culturally extraordinary that it seems in retrospect almost impossible that it should have declined at all. Picture the island of Crete in 1700 BC, the largest island in the Aegean, sitting at the crossroads of the eastern Mediterranean world, equidistant from the coasts of Greece, Egypt, and the Levant, positioned to profit from every trade route that crossed the sea between them. The climate is generous. The soil, particularly in the central plain of Masara, is among the most productive in the region. The coastline offers natural harbors, shelter from the seasonal winds, access points to a maritime world that the Minoans, as we call them, borrowing the name from the legendary king Minos, had made very much their own. At Knossos, on the northern coast, a palace complex of extraordinary scale and complexity sprawls across a low hill above the plain. It is unlike anything built in Europe at this time. A multi-story structure covering over 20,000 square meters, its rooms connected by corridors and staircases that wind through the building in patterns that would later inspire the Greek myth of the labyrinth. Its walls are covered in frescoes of startling vitality. Dolphins leaping through painted water, young men and women performing athletic feats over the backs of charging bulls, processions of gift-bearers moving through landscapes of extraordinary color and life. This is a civilization that understood beauty as a form of power, that invested in art, in craft, in the visual representation of its world, with an intensity that places it among the most aesthetically sophisticated cultures of the ancient Mediterranean. And then, within the space of a century, or perhaps less, the palace culture of Minoan Crete collapsed. The great palaces were destroyed, the population declined. The culture that had produced those extraordinary frescoes and those intricately crafted objects of gold and ivory and polished stone contracted into something fundamentally different. What happened to the Minoans is one of the most debated questions in Aegean archaeology, and one of the most genuinely complex, because the evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously, and the chronology of the events involved is still not fully resolved. The Thera Eruption, the massive volcanic event we explored earlier in this journey, the one that destroyed the Minoan city of Akrotiri and sent tsunamis radiating across the Aegean, has long been the leading candidate in popular accounts of Minoan decline. The connection seems almost too obvious to require argument. The largest volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean in historical times. Tsunamis devastating the northern coast of Crete, where the major Minoan ports were located. Ashfall, disrupting agriculture. A catastrophic environmental shock to a seafaring civilization whose prosperity depended on coastal infrastructure and maritime trade. But the relationship between the Thera eruption and Minoan decline is considerably more complicated than it first appears. The central difficulty is chronological. Radiocarbon dating and ice core evidence consistently place the Thera eruption around 1600 BC, perhaps as early as 1628 BC, based on a frost ring anomaly in tree ring records from that year. But the destruction of the Minoan palaces on Crete is archaeologically dated to around 1450 BC, based on the pottery sequences in the destruction layers. That is a gap of a century and a half. A century and a half between the eruption and the palace destructions, a span of time during which Minoan civilization appears, from the archaeological record, to have continued functioning. The palaces were repaired or rebuilt after the Thera event. Trade continued. The culture persisted. This chronological disconnect has forced archaeologists to look for additional explanations, or to question whether the Thera eruption was truly as devastating to Crete as the simplest version of the story suggests. Some researchers have argued that the dating methods are themselves the problem, that the radiocarbon dates for Thera are being systematically skewed by variations in the atmospheric carbon reservoir, and that the eruption was actually closer to 1500 BC than 1600 BC, which would bring it into much closer proximity with the palace destructions. This argument is technically sophisticated and has attracted serious attention, though it remains contested. The debate about the date of the Thera eruption is one of the most sustained and technically complex arguments in archaeological chronology, with specialists in radiocarbon dating, ice core analysis, tree ring science, and ceramic typology, all engaged in a disagreement that has not yet reached resolution. The mainstream position among most archaeologists, pending resolution of the chronological debate, is that the palace destructions of around 1450 BC were caused not by the Thera eruption directly, but by the Mycenaean Greeks, the mainland Greek civilization whose cultural and political power was rising precisely during this period. The Linear B tablets found at Knossos, the only Minoan palace that appears to have survived the 1450 BC destructions and continued functioning for another generation, are written not in the undeciphered Minoan script known as Linear A, but in an early form of Greek. This suggests that Mycenaean Greeks had taken control of Knossos, and, by implication, of Crete more broadly, following the destructions. In this reading, the end of Minoan civilization was not natural catastrophe, but conquest, the absorption of a sophisticated island culture by a mainland power that recognized what it was acquiring and moved to claim it. But conquest does not fully explain the pattern of destructions either. The 1450 BC destructions affect nearly every palace and significant site on Crete simultaneously, a pattern more consistent with a catastrophic event than with a systematic military campaign, which would typically show a more sequential pattern of site destructions as an army moved through the landscape. Some researchers have proposed a combination, that a natural event, perhaps a series of major earthquakes or the delayed environmental consequences of the Thera eruption, or a second smaller volcanic episode, destabilized Minoan society sufficiently to create the conditions for Mycenaean opportunism. A civilization weakened by environmental shock might be conquered far more easily than one operating at full strength. And then there are the questions about Minoan society that the destructions left permanently unanswered. Linear A, the script the Minoans used for their own administrative records, has never been deciphered. Unlike Linear B, which was cracked by Michael Ventris in 1952 and revealed as an early form of Greek, Linear A remains opaque. We can read the sounds of some of its signs, borrowed from Linear B, but the language it encodes is unknown, not identifiably related to any language family that scholars have been able to connect it to with confidence, which means the Minoans cannot speak to us directly. The administrative records of the palace bureaucracies, the religious texts inscribed on ceremonial objects, the accounts of trade and production and royal authority that the tablets encode, all of it remains locked in a script that our best efforts have not yet opened, a civilization that left extraordinary art, extraordinary architecture, extraordinary craft, and whose own words we cannot read. The frescoes at Knossos were reconstructed by the archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated the site in the early 20th century, and his reconstructions have been extensively criticized for the degree to which they reflect his imagination as much as the original evidence. The blue dolphins, the bull leapers, the processions of gift-bearers. These images are real. The fragments from which they were reconstructed are genuine. But the completed pictures that visitors see today are partly Evans's vision of what Minoan civilization must have looked like, shaped by the aesthetic sensibilities of Edwardian England as much as by the evidence on the ground. We have been looking at the Minoans partly through a lens we constructed ourselves. What did Knossos actually look like to the people who lived and worked within it? What did those frescoed corridors mean to the scribes recording palace inventories, to the craftspeople producing the exquisite objects that have survived in the destruction layers, to the rulers whose authority organized it all? We do not know. We cannot ask. The language is silent. The palace of Knossos was destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, and eventually abandoned. The hill it sits on has been inhabited almost continuously for 10,000 years, longer than almost any other site in Europe. Layer upon layer of human occupation, compressed into the earth, each one partially obscuring and partially preserving what came before. Somewhere in those layers, in the unexcavated portions of the site, in the archives that have not yet been found, or the tablets that have not yet been recovered, is it possible that the key to Linear A still exists? And if it does, what would the Minoans say, given the chance, about how their world ended? The Minoans left us their art and their silence, a civilization whose own words we cannot read, whose ending we reconstruct from fragments that refuse to form a complete picture. Some mysteries are locked in undeciphered script, in the gap between what survived and what was lost. But other mysteries are locked in something more elusive still, in the gap between what people said happened and what actually did. Picture Rome in the summer of 64 AD. The city is, by every measure of the ancient world, extraordinary, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, the capital of an empire stretching from the shores of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the sands of North Africa. Its streets are narrow and densely packed. Its apartment buildings, the insules, rising 5, 6, 7 stories in some areas, their timber frames and tightly compressed construction creating an urban fabric that is, by any modern assessment, a fire waiting to happen. The summer heat has been building for weeks. The air over the city is dry and still. The Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing stadium that can hold 250,000 spectators, sits in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. A valley that, in the right wind conditions, functions almost like a channel, drawing air through it with a directional force. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, fire broke out in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus. What followed over the next 9 days was the most catastrophic urban fire in the history of the ancient Mediterranean world. The fire moved through Rome with a speed and a thoroughness that stunned contemporaries. The narrow streets that defined the urban fabric of the densely populated districts offered no barriers. The flames jumped from building to building, from street to street, driven by the summer wind across a city built largely of wood and fed by the accumulated contents of thousands of apartments, workshops, and warehouses. Of the 14 administrative districts of Rome, 10 were damaged. 3 were destroyed completely, reduced to ash and rubble. The Temple of Jupiter Stator, the Great Circus itself, the ancient Palatine neighborhood where Rome's aristocratic families had lived for generations, all of it burned. The ancient sources, principally Tacitus, writing several decades after the event, and Suetonius and Cassius Dio writing later still, agree on the basic facts of the destruction. Where they diverge, where the history becomes genuinely contested, is in the question of cause and culpability. And at the center of that question stands the figure of Nero. Nero Claudius Caesar was 26 years old when the fire broke out. He had been emperor for 10 years, having inherited the throne at 16. His reign had already been marked by episodes of extraordinary violence, the murder of his own mother Agrippina, the execution of his first wife Octavia, a pattern of behavior that combined genuine artistic sensibility with a capacity for brutality that his contemporaries found both fascinating and terrifying. The most famous story associated with the Great Fire is also almost certainly false. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, playing his instrument on a tower or on the stage, singing of the destruction of Troy while the city burned below him, is a piece of mythology that does not survive serious historical scrutiny. The fiddle did not exist in the 1st century AD, and Tacitus, our most detailed source for the fire, explicitly states that Nero was at Antium, approximately 60 kilometers south of Rome, when the fire began, and that he returned to the city as the fire spread. Tacitus records that Nero opened his private gardens to displaced citizens, organized emergency food supplies, and superintended the distribution of relief. These are not the actions of a man celebrating his city's destruction, and yet the suspicion that Nero was somehow responsible, that the fire was deliberately set on his orders, or encouraged, or allowed to spread when it could have been contained, attaches to him in the ancient sources with a persistence that suggests it was widely believed in his own time. Why? The most politically compelling piece of evidence cited by those who suspected Nero was what he did after the fire. On the land cleared by the flames in the heart of Rome, the Palatine and its surroundings, Nero built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace complex of almost hallucinatory ambition, a vast private estate in the middle of the city, its grounds including a lake, vineyards, parkland, and a network of rooms decorated with rotating ceilings, ivory panels, and gem-encrusted walls. Its entrance was dominated by a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, over 30 meters tall. The fire had, conveniently, created exactly the space in the heart of Rome that such a project required. Tacitus acknowledges the suspicion while not fully endorsing it. He notes that some people believe the fire was deliberately set, and that Nero's subsequent use of the cleared land supported that interpretation. He also notes that the rumor was impossible to confirm or deny. Suetonius is less circumspect, stating that Nero sent men dressed as servants through the city with torches. Cassius Dio, writing later, is similarly direct in his accusation. But all of these writers were working decades or centuries after the event, in a political culture that had developed complex reasons, some legitimate, some polemical, for portraying Nero as a monster. The literary tradition of Neronian villainy was well established by the time these accounts were written, and it is genuinely difficult to disentangle historical fact from politically motivated retrospective condemnation. The purely accidental explanation has considerable practical support. Rome burned repeatedly throughout its history. Fires were a constant feature of urban life in a city built largely of timber, densely packed, lit by oil lamps and heated by open fires, without any organized fire suppression infrastructure of meaningful scale. The conditions in July 64 AD, summer heat, dry air, densely combustible urban fabric, the channeling effect of the Circus Maximus Valley, were entirely sufficient to produce a catastrophic fire without any human agency beyond accident or carelessness. The fire started in the commercial area around the circus, an area of workshops and warehouses where the combination of stored goods, open flames for cooking and heating, and the concentration of flammable materials would have created genuinely high fire risk. This is not an implausible origin point for an accidental fire, but the ancient reports of people being prevented from fighting the fire, of witnesses seeing individuals actively spreading the flames rather than suppressing them, of the fire being restarted after it was initially brought under control. These details, if accurate, point toward deliberate action. Whether that action was directed by Nero, carried out by agents acting on his behalf, or perpetrated by other parties with their own agendas, criminal opportunists, religious zealots, political enemies of the regime, the ancient sources do not definitively resolve. The Christians, newly present in Rome, were the group Nero chose to blame. Tacitus, with something that reads as a mixture of credulity and discomfort, records that Nero accused them of starting the fire and subjected them to punishments of particular cruelty, torn apart by animals in the arena, crucified, set on fire themselves as human torches in Nero's gardens. Tacitus notes that even a population that had little sympathy for the Christians felt that their suffering was motivated not by genuine guilt, but by one man's cruelty and need for a scapegoat. The persecution of the Christians in the aftermath of the Great Fire is one of the earliest documented interactions between the Roman state and the early Christian community. It left a mark on Christian historical memory that shaped the relationship between Christianity and Rome for generations. The image of Nero as the first great persecutor, a figure who would be identified in some Christian traditions with the Antichrist. Whether the Christians were guilty of anything beyond belonging to a new and poorly understood religious movement, whether any human agency, Christian or otherwise, caused the fire, remains unresolved. Nero himself was dead within 4 years of the fire, overthrown by a military revolt, dying by his own hand in June 68 AD. The Domus Aurea, his great palace built on the cleared heart of Rome, was dismantled by his successors, its rooms filled with rubble and its land repurposed. The Colosseum was built on the site of the lake that had been its centerpiece, a deliberate act of political symbolism, converting the private pleasure of a tyrant into public spectacle for the Roman people. The city that burned was rebuilt, more carefully, with wider streets and stone construction requirements that reduced the fire risk in the rebuilt districts. Rome absorbed its catastrophe and continued. But the question of who lit the first flame, or who prevented the first flames from being extinguished, has never been answered with evidence sufficient to close the case. Nero looked out from his returning chariot at a city burning. What did he feel in that moment? Relief? Horror? The complicated mixture of a man watching something terrible unfold and recognizing, in the disaster, the shape of an opportunity he had not anticipated. Or simply the shock of a young emperor confronting the limits of what even the ruler of the world could control. The fire consumed the evidence along with the city, and the truth, if it was ever recorded, did not survive the flames. The truth about Rome's Great Fire did not survive the flames. The evidence burned with the city, leaving behind only the competing testimonies of writers who were not present, shaped by politics and time and the particular distortions that accumulate around powerful men doing terrible things, or being accused of them. But sometimes the evidence does survive. Sometimes the earth itself becomes a vault, sealing a moment in time with such completeness, such sudden and overwhelming force, that what lies beneath it is preserved not despite the catastrophe, but because of it. We have been here before, in a sense. Earlier in this journey, we stood in the streets of Akrotiri, preserved beneath volcanic ash, and felt the particular quality of a civilization caught mid-breath. Now we return to the volcanic world, to the shadow of a different mountain, on a different coast, 15 centuries later. Picture the Bay of Naples on the morning of August 24th, 79 AD. The water is calm and intensely blue. The coastline curves in a generous arc, its towns and villas arranged along the shore with the comfortable prosperity of a region that has served as the leisure destination of Rome's wealthy classes for generations. Baiae with its thermal springs, Pompeii with its busy commercial streets, and slightly north of Pompeii, sitting directly at the foot of Vesuvius on a narrow coastal shelf between the mountain and the sea, the prosperous town of Herculaneum. Herculaneum was smaller than Pompeii, but, by most measures, wealthier. Its streets were paved, its houses were large and well appointed. Its population, estimated at around 4,000 to 5,000 people, included a significant proportion of affluent Romans who had chosen this stretch of coastline for their residences, drawn by the combination of sea views, easy access to Naples, and the particular beauty of a town built on a promontory above the water. By midnight on August 24th, 79 AD, most of them were dead. The story of Vesuvius and its victims is one of the best documented natural disasters of the ancient world, thanks to 2 letters written by Pliny the Younger to the historian Tacitus. Letters that constitute the oldest surviving eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption and describe in remarkable detail the events as experienced from across the bay at Misenum. Pliny watched the eruption column rise above Vesuvius. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, sailed toward the disaster in an attempt to rescue survivors, and died on the beach at Stabiae, most likely from the toxic gases that accompanied the eruption's later phases. The fate of Pompeii, buried under meters of pumice and ash, its citizens caught in the act of fleeing or sheltering, their bodies preserved as plaster casts in the cavities left by their decomposed remains, is well known. What is less widely understood, and what the archaeology of Herculaneum has revealed in ways that continue to disturb and fascinate researchers, is that the 2 towns died very differently. Pompeii received a slow accumulation of pumice and ash over many hours, giving at least some of its population time to flee before the more lethal phases of the eruption arrived. Herculaneum received almost no pumice fall in the initial phase, a fact that appears to have led many of its residents to believe initially that they were not in immediate danger. While Pompeii was being buried, Herculaneum watched from its promontory and perhaps felt a cautious relief. That relief was catastrophically misplaced. In the early hours of August 25th, a series of pyroclastic surges and flows, superheated clouds of gas, ash, and volcanic debris moving at enormous speed down the flanks of Vesuvius, reached Herculaneum in rapid succession. The temperature of these flows has been estimated at between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius. The first surge reached the town before most people had time to react. The deaths at Herculaneum were almost instantaneous. Not the slow suffocation of Pompeii's ashfall, but a thermal pulse of extraordinary intensity that killed everyone it touched within seconds, before burying them under meters of volcanic material that hardened, over time, into a matrix as solid as concrete. For 17 centuries, Herculaneum lay sealed beneath that matrix. When excavations began in the 18th century, the hardness of the volcanic material made progress slow, difficult, and destructive. Tunnels were driven through the compacted mass, recovering artworks and objects, but often destroying the archaeological context that would have made them more meaningful. Then, in 1982, excavations at the ancient shoreline of Herculaneum, the beach and the boat chambers cut into the volcanic rock below the town, revealed something that transformed our understanding of the disaster. Skeletons. Hundreds of them. Packed into the arched boat chambers that line the ancient waterfront and scattered across the beach itself, were the remains of people who had gathered at the shore in the final hours before the pyroclastic flows arrived. More than 300 skeletons have been recovered from this area, the largest group of Vesuvius victims ever found in a single location. Men, women, children, infants, people of different social classes, their status readable in their jewelry, their dental health, the tools they carried. They had come to the shore seeking rescue by sea, waiting for boats that, in the chaos of the eruption, either could not reach them or never came. The boat chambers, cut into the volcanic cliff below the town, may have seemed to offer shelter from the ash and pumice falling elsewhere. Or perhaps the beach simply represented the last available direction, with the mountain above them and the sea in front. There was nowhere else to go. The pyroclastic surge that killed them arrived while they waited. The forensic analysis of the Herculaneum skeletons has generated research of extraordinary scientific value and, in some areas, genuinely disturbing findings. Studies of the bone chemistry have allowed researchers to reconstruct aspects of the population's diet, health, and origins with a precision unavailable for almost any other ancient population. Evidence of childhood malnutrition recorded in tooth enamel, signs of heavy physical labor in the skeletal structure of individuals who, based on their location in the boat chambers, may have been among the town's enslaved population. The complex social stratification of a prosperous Roman town, written into the bones of its dead. One study, published in 2018, proposed that the extreme heat of the pyroclastic surge had been sufficient to vaporize soft tissue and cause the instantaneous boiling of body fluids, a mechanism that would explain certain characteristics of the skeletal remains, including the apparent explosion of some skulls from internal pressure. The finding generated significant attention and some controversy, with other researchers questioning the interpretation of the evidence. The debate reflects the broader challenge of reading volcanic death across 2 millennia of burial. But the truly mysterious aspect of Herculaneum's story does not lie in the manner of death. It lies in a question that the demographics of the dead raise with uncomfortable directness. Where are all the people? The population of Herculaneum has been estimated at 4,000 to 5,000. The skeletons recovered from the waterfront number in the hundreds, a significant proportion perhaps, but not the majority of the town's inhabitants. Pompeii, with a much larger population, has yielded around 2,000 victims from its ruins, a fraction of the people who lived there. The conventional explanation is that most of the population fled successfully. The eruption began in the early afternoon of August 24th, and for many hours the initial phase, the column of ash and pumice rising above the mountain, provided warning without immediate lethal impact. People who chose to leave early, who had carts or horses or the physical capacity to move quickly, may have escaped the worst phases of the eruption entirely. This explanation is probably correct, in broad terms. Roman roads leading away from the area would have been crowded with refugees. Records from other towns in the region suggest an influx of displaced persons in the aftermath of the eruption. But something quieter disturbs this picture. If the majority fled, where are the records of the survivors? Roman administrative culture was extensive and thorough. Property records, census documents, the legal instruments of a society that tracked ownership and status with considerable care. Some trace of the displaced population of Herculaneum should, in principle, appear somewhere in the documentary record of the Roman world. It does occasionally. There are scattered references to Herculanenses in documents from the decades following the eruption. But the record is thinner than might be expected. Families dispersed. Property claims became legally complex when the land itself was buried under meters of volcanic material. The community, even for those who survived, effectively ceased to exist as a coherent social entity. Beneath the modern town of Herculaneum, built over the volcanic matrix that encases the ancient city, the majority of Herculaneum remains unexcavated. The volcanic material that killed its inhabitants also preserved their world with extraordinary completeness. Wooden furniture, carbonized scrolls in a private library, food still in its containers, the organic materials that almost never survive in normal archaeological conditions. The Villa of the Papyri, partially explored in the 18th century through those destructive tunnels, yielded nearly 2,000 carbonized papyrus scrolls, the largest library to survive from the ancient world. Most of them remain unread, too fragile to unroll, too damaged by carbonization to decipher with conventional methods. New imaging technology, multispectral scanning, X-ray phase contrast tomography, has in recent years begun to read the invisible text on these carbonized scrolls, recovering words and sentences from documents that had not been read since the morning Vesuvius changed everything. What else is down there, beneath the modern streets, waiting for the technology that can finally reach it? And among the scrolls not yet read, the rooms not yet excavated, the lives not yet recovered from the volcanic matrix that sealed them. Is it possible that someone, in those final hours, wrote down what they saw? The carbonized scrolls of Herculaneum hold words not yet read, a library sealed by volcanic force, waiting for the technology patient enough to unlock it. Some of the ancient world's knowledge survived the catastrophe that buried it. It simply waits, in the dark, for the right moment to be heard again. That image, of something extraordinary preserved beneath the surface, misunderstood or overlooked or deliberately obscured until the right eyes finally find it, runs through this entire journey like a thread. And nowhere does it run more clearly or more painfully than in the story of Great Zimbabwe. Picture the southeastern highlands of the African interior in the 11th century AD. The landscape here is one of the most distinctive in the world. Great rounded granite outcrops, called kopjes, rising from the open grassland of the plateau in formations that seem almost architectural in their irregularity, as if the earth itself had been interrupted mid-construction and left its work unfinished. The altitude keeps the temperature moderate. The grassland is good cattle country. The rivers run down toward the Lowveld and eventually to the Indian Ocean coast, 300 miles to the east. It is in this landscape, on a gentle slope between a granite-crowned hill and an open plain, that someone began, sometime around the 11th century AD, to build in stone. Not to build with mortar, not with the cut and fitted stone of Roman construction or the precisely shaped blocks of Egyptian pyramid building, but with granite, carefully selected and expertly stacked, dry stone construction of extraordinary skill. Courses of stone laid with a regularity and a precision that, in the most accomplished sections, achieves an almost decorative elegance. Walls that curve, enclosures within enclosures, a conical tower, solid and purposeful, rising from within the great enclosure to a height of nearly 10 meters, its function still debated, its presence still imposing after 7 centuries. At its height between roughly 1250 and 1450 AD, Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a kingdom of considerable power and reach, the center of a trade network that connected the gold-producing interior of southern Africa to the Swahili coast, and, through it, to the Indian Ocean world of Arab, Persian, and eventually Chinese commerce. Gold, ivory, cattle, moving outward from the plateau toward the sea, returning as glass beads, porcelain, and cloth from as far away as Persia and China. The artifacts recovered from Great Zimbabwe's ruins reflect this reach with startling directness. Chinese Celadon pottery, Persian faience, glass beads from the Indian Ocean trade network, objects that had traveled thousands of miles to reach a hilltop enclosure in the interior of southern Africa, evidence not of isolation, but of deep connection to the wider medieval world. And then, sometime in the mid-15th century, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. The population dispersed. The capital relocated. The stone walls were left to the encroaching vegetation and the slow, patient work of time. When Portuguese traders on the Swahili coast began recording accounts of the interior in the 16th century, they collected stories of a great stone city. The Swahili word Zimbabwe, meaning stone houses or venerated houses, pointed toward something significant in the interior. But the city itself, by the time European interest in it began to crystallize, was already a ruin. Its last inhabitants gone, its institutional memory fading into the surrounding landscape. The first Europeans to reach the ruins arrived in the 19th century and promptly, almost systematically, refused to believe what African people had built. This is the point at which the story of Great Zimbabwe becomes something more than an archaeological mystery. It becomes a case study in the way that ideology can corrupt inquiry, in the way that what investigators want to find shapes what they claim to have found. Karl Mauch, the German explorer who visited the ruins in 1871, concluded that they had been built by Phoenicians, or possibly by the Queen of Sheba. The sophistication of the construction, in his estimation, simply exceeded what Africans were capable of producing. Subsequent investigators, some of them employed by the commercial interests of Cecil Rhodes, who wanted evidence that the interior of Africa had been settled and developed by outsiders, providing ideological justification for colonial extraction, consistently attempted to attribute Great Zimbabwe to non-African builders. Arabs, Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, anyone but the ancestors of the people who actually lived there. The fraud was deliberate in some cases. A professional archaeologist named Richard Hall, appointed to excavate Great Zimbabwe in the early 20th century, systematically destroyed the stratigraphic record of the site, removing meters of accumulated deposit in an effort to reach the levels he believed would show non-African construction. He destroyed, irretrievably, the archaeological context of the upper levels of the site. Evidence that might have answered questions about the site's occupation, its chronology, and the details of its abandonment was removed and discarded in service of a conclusion that had been reached before the excavation began. The damage was acknowledged and condemned by professional archaeologists at the time. David Randall McIver, who examined the site in 1905, and Gertrude Caton Thompson, who conducted rigorous excavations in 1929, both concluded unambiguously that Great Zimbabwe was built by Bantu-speaking African people, ancestors of the Shona, and that the evidence for this was overwhelming. Their conclusions were largely ignored by the colonial establishment, which continued to promote the Phoenician hypothesis in popular accounts and tourist literature for decades. The political stakes of this argument were not academic. In what would become Rhodesia, and later Zimbabwe, the question of who built the stone walls was inseparable from the question of who had the right to the land, the resources, and the political authority of the region. Acknowledging African authorship of Great Zimbabwe meant acknowledging a sophisticated pre-colonial African civilization, a fact incompatible with the ideological foundations of settler colonialism. The ruins themselves became a site of political contestation. The name of the modern nation of Zimbabwe, adopted at independence in 1980, is drawn directly from the stone enclosures, a deliberate act of reclamation, a statement about the continuity between the pre-colonial civilization and the post-colonial state. But the political resolution of the attribution question did not resolve the archaeological mysteries that the site still holds. Why was Great Zimbabwe abandoned? The mainstream explanations focus on the same convergence of factors we have encountered elsewhere in this journey: environmental stress and political competition. The plateau around Great Zimbabwe supported large cattle herds, and cattle were the primary measure of wealth and power in the Zimbabwe culture. Over the centuries of the site's occupation, the grazing land around the capital was progressively degraded, overgrazed, stripped of the vegetation that maintained the soil, unable to support the density of cattle that a large royal household required. The capital needed to move to find fresh grazing. This explanation is ecologically coherent and supported by paleoenvironmental evidence from the region. Political fragmentation compounded the environmental pressure. The Zimbabwe Plateau was not a unified state with a single unchallenged capital. It was a competitive landscape in which powerful lineages contested control of trade routes and cattle herds. By the 15th century, rival centers, particularly Kami to the west and the Mutapa Kingdom to the north, had grown sufficiently powerful to challenge Great Zimbabwe's dominance of the regional trade network. The gold trade routes were shifting. The economic foundation that had sustained the capital's growth was eroding. The abandonment in this reading was not catastrophic but rational, a ruling elite following the resources and the political opportunities that had moved elsewhere, leaving behind the stone enclosures that had defined their authority, but that had no value without the people and the cattle and the trade that gave them meaning. But there are aspects of the abandonment that this explanation does not fully account for. The speed of the transition. The degree to which knowledge of the site faded so completely that 16th century Portuguese accounts treat it as already mysterious, already ancient, already disconnected from living memory of its function and its builders. A capital does not typically lose its institutional memory within a generation or two, unless something more disruptive than a gradual relocation was involved. Some researchers have pointed to the possibility of a more violent transition. Internal conflict, a breakdown in the political order of the Zimbabwe culture that went beyond the normal competition of rival lineages. The archaeological evidence for this is limited and ambiguous, but the rapidity of the abandonment and the depth of the subsequent amnesia are difficult to explain through orderly relocation alone. The great enclosure still stands. The conical tower still rises from its interior, its purpose still unresolved, a granary, a symbol of royal authority, an astronomical marker, a monument to a concept we no longer have the cultural framework to recognize. The walls still curve across the hillside with their quiet, self-assured precision, the craftsmanship of people who knew exactly what they were doing, and did it with a confidence that 7 centuries of weathering have not diminished. What decisions were made within those walls? What disputes were settled? What alliances forged? What trade arrangements negotiated in the space enclosed by that elegant stonework? And somewhere beneath the surface of a site whose upper layers were largely destroyed by a man determined not to find what was actually there, is it possible that the evidence that could finally answer those questions still survives? What did the last people to leave Great Zimbabwe take with them? And what did they leave behind in the walls and the soil and the long silence of the plateau that we have not yet found the means to read?